It sounded like the generator was running.
My brother was a Navy pilot. He's getting to be up once. Where do you go on vacation? We would drive to Maine. We would take 2 days. Is that a Sturbridge? Yeah.
We left at 5. I ended up stopping at Memphis Johnson. But it took me about 55 minutes to get from Baltimore State. The roll over there. You mean because our streets are falling in?
I turn on my ways in the mornings. Parts of South Side.
That's always been a beauty of GPS. What street it is.
My wife goes, as the crow flies, 2.5 miles to work. I mean, you have to drive out from the harbor.
Where do you live?
So, but because of that street code, and all the traffic being rerouted away from the 395, keep highways controlled, so it took her 45 years. And she leaves at like 7:40. Well, see, I think on the road it's 4.5. As do I. My office is 2.5 blocks from my house, so I don't understand people who drive anymore. I've gotten so used to it, I don't know that I can go back. Well, when we first moved here, I was working in DC, so I got 3 hours.
Somebody's going to start asking what the rain delay rules are. Did you scare them all off, Steve?
So he called me on the way down here. There's an email, which I think you may be copied on. He sent that to me. I keep wondering about he sent it today. The guy from so he was sitting on the floor, and the younger guy with the ear. He called call me today. They've been at the site, telling me how slowly they're getting the materials. They said, "Where are these tanks and bushes?" So there's some faults, which I think is what there's reference to. So I think that's what everybody. Thank you. Probably makes sense.
Just kidding.
Don't get me going. Jenkins is supposed to call this stuff. He matches his location. They seem to be except this guy. So I'm stone, whatever it is. Right, I think that because of that, and before America, I don't know why. My assumption is that because they're not but they're too maybe but we had no yeah, they're uniform pieces. At this point. It did not. I didn't know this much
Welcome, everyone. I apologize that we're a little late getting started. The weather apparently has interfered with transportation for some of us. I also apologize for the apparent lack of air conditioning. If it gets too bad at some point, we'll have to decide whether it makes sense to continue or recess to another time. I'll call to order the meeting of the City of Annapolis Board of Appeals for the special meeting, July 17th, 2019. Tammy, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Gallagher?
Yes.
Mr. Zazali? Ms. Shine? Mr. Walsh?
Present.
Mr. Burnett?
Present.
All right, so we do have a quorum tonight. Unfortunately, we don't have a full board. We may have one or two others join us.
Mr. Chairman, may I just put something on the record as we begin?
Yeah.
I was not a participant in the last meeting. However, I have viewed the entire videotape of the last meeting. I wasn't a participating member in the first meeting in May. So I just wanted that to be said, that I'm caught up and read in.
Right. Under the board's rules, Rule 6.0, I'll authorize Mr. Walsh to join us for the hearing of the remainder of the case, based on his representation that he's reviewed the videotape and the exhibits in the case. We do not have with us tonight special counsel for the board, Chris Beard, so we'll be performing without a safety net. Have the members of the board had a chance to review the agenda? Any changes or suggestions or corrections? Thank you. There's one item on the agenda tonight, the continuation of our hearing in appeal number 2018-002, Lofts at Eastport. Again, we're going to do our best to hear as much evidence and argument as we can. It would be great if we could conclude tonight. If we do not finish tonight, and we'll recess around 11 o'clock if we're not done by then, the hearing will be recessed and we'll reconvene on September 18th. As always, you can help us get through this by keeping in mind a couple of things. The board has read all of the submissions, so you don't need to repeat what's in them. Please keep your testimony focused on the criteria for the different issues that are in the case. We're not going to hear any evidence relating exclusively to site design plan, only to the adequate public facilities certification. Generally, we don't take public testimony in appeals cases, but if a member of the public believes they have something that's relevant to those criteria, we'll let you tell us about that. We may impose time limits. If the case is continued, if it appears the case is going to be continued to another night, we may consider public testimony toward the end of the evening in order to accommodate anyone who would like to testify, who believes they have something to add, who won't be able to come on September 18th. So would everyone who has not previously taken an oath and who would like to testify tonight, please stand and raise their right hand. Do you swear or affirm, subject to the penalty of perjury, that the testimony you will give is true to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
Thank you. You may be seated. For public witnesses, please sign up on the sign-up sheet at the podium. Your name, address, whether you support or oppose the appeal, and please indicate any economic interest that you have or relationship to the applicant. Before we pick up where we left off last time, there are still a couple of preliminary issues. As a matter of public disclosure, I would like to disclose that I received this morning a call from Walter Vasquez, a local restaurant owner. He inquired about the schedule in the case and the opportunity for public testimony. I told him that if the case did not conclude tonight, it would be continued in September or October, and that public witnesses usually testify at the end of the case, but the board might provide an opportunity for public testimony tonight. There have been a couple of preliminary issues raised. We'll start with notice of the proceedings. Let me ask you a question or two, Mr. Rogers. Was there a problem with public notice for the hearing that we held on June 4th?
No.
Okay. Have you read Board Rule 6Q?
Yes.
And do you still insist that we have a problem with effective public notice for this hearing?
No, I just thought it was a matter of fairness because the posters at the site of the proposed development had, due to the weather, had been deteriorated and non-existent for the last several weeks. And in being, advising the public of what's going on has been a significant issue in this case. And I thought it would be in the interest of the public that the posters would be put back up or replaced or something. I have no objection to anything else. I was just trying to get the posters put back up, but the city did not respond to that. So I have no further objections on the issue.
Have the posters been put back up?
I didn't look today, it was too hot.
Have the posters been put back up? Are we going to do that?
If you require it, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that sounds good. I'll require it. What's the harm?
Then we'll do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Rogers again.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
if I may get some clarification. I mean, the rules don't require that, but you want us to post, 15 days before the next hearing, assuming we have the next hearing, or how do you want us to handle that?
I'd like the posters to go back up and change the date to the date of the next hearing,
Okay.
so that people know they still have an opportunity to be heard if they'd like to. The matter continues. If they'd like to be heard, they can do that.
And when do you want them up by? Because they don't last but so long. They're cardboard signs. They're not going to hold up for
So what's the rule in advance?
15 days.
So let's do it 15 days in advance.
15 days prior to the next hearing. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Rogers, you filed a document hard to describe. I call it a motion for directed verdict and summary judgment. Do you recall the order previously entered in these proceedings that you get permission before you file a motion?
I apologize, I do not remember that.
Well, the reason for that ruling was because in this case, and that order was unique to this case, there have been in the past a number of motions filed that, in my view, were a waste of the time of the board and the other people in the room. We have tried to accord you, because you're not a lawyer, all the latitude we can, but there are limits. There's no such thing as a motion for a directed verdict in this context. There conceivably could be a motion for summary judgment, but you're nowhere close to it. So, in my view, and the reason for the order is it would be a waste of time and money to require Mr. Elson, Mr. Hyatt to respond to that. That's why I entered the previous order asking you to seek permission before you file a motion. So that motion, either it doesn't exist or it's denied, and we'll move on to the case. Do you have a problem with that?
Yes.
Tell me what it is, briefly.
Well, you indicated there were a lot of useless motions in the first part of the case before the first hearing. I did not initiate those motions. Mr. Hyatt initiated them.
I remember very clearly you had an earlier motion for summary judgment that was...
No, excuse me, sir. Mr. Hyatt started the motions business. I had no motions on the floor until Mr. Hyatt started trying to silence me.
All right. That's history.
Okay.
No more motions without permission. Is that understood?
Well, I think you want to have this motion because there's a matter of law.
I understand your point, but you have complained from the beginning that Mr. Hyatt was trying to silence you and your case and those who are associated with you. That's exactly what you're trying to do there. You're asking us to decide this case in your favor before he's done putting his case on.
No, sir, that's not the...
That's what your motion says. I read it.
No, it is not. The motion says that it lacks jurisdiction. I'm not trying to decide the case at all. I'm
There's
trying to
no
say it
basis.
has to be remanded.
There's no basis for your case that it lacks jurisdiction. We're going to hear this case. Understand
I
that.
object. You don't have the authority to overrule the Secretary of Environment. And I object.
I'm not going to overrule the Secretary. of
Yes, you are.
Environment. All right, let's get on with business. I'm not going to consider any more motions unless you first get permission. Is that understood?
Do you want to give me permission tonight?
No.
I've been told I can't communicate with you.
You can't communicate with me. You communicate through Ms. Rouse, and she'll forward it to me and the other members of the board. That's the way it's done. There's a rule against ex parte communication between parties, anyone, and members of the board regarding a pending matter. That's against our rules, it's against ethics rules, it's against state rules. It's not that I don't like hearing from you, Mr.
Well, I object.
All right, Mr. Hyatt.
Thank you. I would call my first witness, David Jarrell.
Where would you like me to sit?
The end.
How about over there, because we don't have anybody there.
Good evening, Mr. Jarrell. Would you state your name and address for the record, please?
Yes, David Jarrell, 323 Spinnaker Road, Severna Park,
And what is your job?
Director of Public Works.
In your capacity as Director of Public Works for the City of Annapolis, are you familiar with Chapter 22 of the Annapolis City Code?
I am, yes.
When an application is made for a certification of adequate facilities, does the Department of Public Works review it?
We do, yes.
I refer you to three specific sections in the code. One is 22.16, one is 22.18, and one is 22.24. I have copies if you need them, but are you familiar with those code
Yes, I
sections?
am.
Directing your attention to 22.16. That's the review criteria for the what's called the public maintenance services. And the code states that the standards are determined by the Director of Public Works. And there's a goal of adequate public maintenance facilities to ensure that there's safe and efficient service provided for trash pickup and snow removal and road maintenance. As part of the application submitted by the lofts at Eastport Landing, did you consider 22.16 and the public maintenance requirements?
Yes, we did.
What did you do? Describe for the board what it is you
Well,
did.
we looked at what public works services were going to be required. And as you mentioned, that would possibly include street maintenance, snow removal, and trash collection, trash and recycling collection. Since this is going to be a private facility where the streets are all going to be private, and the trash collection is going to be private, this development's not going to require any of those public works services.
So that's a pretty easy conclusion to reach, that under 22.16, the applicant, the lofts at Eastport Landing did satisfy the...
Right, there's no additional services provided by Public Works due to this development.
All right, referring you to Chapter 22.18, and that's the review criteria for adequate water and sewer facilities. Did your department also consider whether there was adequate water and sewer facilities for the lofts at Eastport Landing?
Yes, we did.
As part of that review, did you review what has been labeled as Exhibit 4, the applicant's Exhibit 4, which is the document, and I can show this to you if you don't recall it. It's the document prepared by Bay Engineering entitled Adequate Public Facility Study for the Lofts at Eastport Landing. You familiar with that?
I am, yeah. I reviewed that very briefly, but my staff reviewed it in great detail.
So, I mean, this report was analyzed by your staff, and,
That's correct.
and Ms. Burkhardt is going to talk about the details of
Correct.
water and sewer adequacy. And then the third topic that I believe is covered by your department concerns whether there's adequacy of stormwater management facilities. Is that also correct?
Correct, yes,
And that's under 22.24 of the code, right?
correct.
Under that section, there's a reference to Chapter 17.10 of the code, so that the applicant has to satisfy your department that the proposed stormwater management facility satisfies 17.10 of the code. Is that
That's
correct?
correct. Yeah, that's the basis that we use to
And
judge.
then, again, referring you to the exhibits, there's an exhibit number 5, that is final storm drain and stormwater management report for the lofts at Eastport Landing. Are you also familiar with that?
Yes,
Who in your department did the review of this?
Matt Waters.
And Mr. Waters will testify
Correct.
tonight, right? There was a memorandum that you gave to Mr. Gutwald when he was the Director of Planning and Zoning here, dated November 13th, 2018. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And that is, let's see, just for the benefit of the board. That is Exhibit 1B. And that document says that the department is satisfied that the proposed development has adequate public facilities under each of those code sections, 2216, 2218, and 22.24. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
The fact that your office recommended, or your department recommended, that there's adequacy and a certification was ultimately issued by the Director of Planning and Zoning doesn't mean that there's not a more thorough review going forward. Is that true?
That's correct, yeah. They have to go through the whole permitting process. Yeah,
And so when the applicant proceeds with a request for a grading permit, for example, and any other permits related to actually constructing the project, what happens?
well, they'll have to, number one, they'll have to resubmit the stormwater plan that was submitted. We reviewed the initial one. I think we had some comments. Those will be incorporated into the final report that's submitted with the grading permit. So those submissions are much more detailed than what the adequate public facilities documents are.
But at this stage, you're satisfied it
Yes.
meets adequacy.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions at this time.
Gary?
I have just a few. On stormwater management, do you know if city standards meet or equal state standards for stormwater management?
Yeah, the standards that are in the code reflect the state standards. So they're identical to the state standards.
Okay. And that's my only question. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers?
Good evening, David Carroll. Did I send you an email referring to something called NPDES?
Probably, yes,
You know what that is?
I do.
Can you explain to the room what it is?
Yeah, it deals with non-point source discharges into water bodies and the requirement to get those NPDES permits for discharges into our water bodies.
Thank you. Did you make a comment in your recommendation regarding 221010 Delta the capital improvement program?
No, we did not.
Is that required?
No.
The general review criteria says it is.
There's no capital projects that are required due to this
The
project.
capital improvement program, including protected facilities, the comprehensive plan is defining and any other land use condition that the Director of Planning and Zoning may reasonably describe to be considered by the department. And that's supposed to be, shall take into consideration.
Well, certainly if we didn't have adequate public facilities on the water side or in any of the three areas that we consider and needed to have a capital project to address those, then it would be addressed as part of the adequate public facilities. But there's no capital projects required for the city for this project.
But you didn't make a comment to the negative saying there is no.
No, but we would have
element.
to the positive if a project was required.
Have you looked at the discharge point for the 42-inch stormwater
I
pipe?
personally have not, no.
Has anybody in your department looked at it?
I can't answer that because I don't have knowledge if they did or not.
Well, you told me they had in a meeting we had.
I'm not sure that I told you that or not. I don't recall stating that.
If I told you the plans that have been submitted by the applicant are trying to put water from a 27-inch pipe into a 24-inch pipe, would you believe me?
I would, yeah, I mean, it's conceivable that that could be happening, sure. Would I have concerns about it? Yes, I would have concerns.
Is that good design practice?
No.
Not. Well, I have a exhibit over here if you'd like me to show it to you. Would you like to see it?
Sure.
So what does this pipe here, what's the size of the pipe? This is the exhibit 5 of the pellet.
Mr. Chairman, we can't tell what's going on.
Do you want to join them and take a look at it?
I'm sorry, could you, sir,
24 inch.
hang on, Mr. Rogers, can you tell me what exhibit that is, please?
This is the City of Public Works operations drawing.
Exhibit number.
Sanitary pipe,
What's the number?
5,
Thank you. Of applicant. Applicant exhibit 5.
pellet.
Appellant exhibit 5. Thank you.
So Mr. Gerald has identified that as a 24-inch pipe. And that connects across. And the drawings which Mr. Pike, applicant, provided show that that's a existing 27-inch pipe. That's a mistake. It's not existing.
Objection. You say it's a mistake.
All right,
So I just
objection.
showed you that there, the city's drawing, and it shows what's existing.
All right. Hold on a second, Mr. Rogers. There's been an objection.
Well, the objection is he's characterizing it as a mistake.
Right, you can ask the witness what the facts are.
Did you see the drawing submitted by the applicant?
I did. I haven't verified it in the field. One says 24 inch, one says 27 inch. I agree with you about that. I don't know which is the correct one. 24.
Mr.
Yeah.
Rogers, microphone.
It's nice to be able to get up and walk around. I'm sorry. So I presented, I don't have a number on the exhibit from the applicant. There was no number on that. Maybe there is.
That's all right. The important point is his testimony.
And the witness has identified that on the applicant's drawing, he saw the pipe labeled as 27 inches, and on the city's existing drawing of utilities and operations, it shows an existing 24-inch pipe. So my question to him was, it's bad practice to try and stuff more water in the pipe into a smaller pipe.
Yeah, I mean, just if the pipe slopes are the same, then that's a bad idea. If the smaller pipe has a steeper slope, then that's not necessarily bad practice. So you'd have to look at the
Do you know why
the
they've
system
come
line.
up with this 27-inch pipe?
I'm sorry, I don't
It's a new
understand your
pipe.
question.
27-inch pipe is a new pipe. It goes around the bottom of this project.
Hmm.
Do you know why?
I do not know.
They're taking out,
Objection.
Probably should be asking these questions.
Objection,
to
yeah.
my
are they
utilities engineer.
taking out a drain pipe that runs across the project? These are the
I
drawings.
can't answer that, but I'm happy to have my utilities engineer who did a detailed review of these plans address those questions.
All right, so you don't know anything about the pipe.
Not to that level of detail to answer your questions.
So I'll ask you a hypothetical. If that pipe is a new pipe that's supposed to be carrying the flow from the whole site, would you think that that pipe is going to be pretty full?
Again, I don't have the details of this project enough to know the answer to that.
Okay. Is the final stormwater management report, you said Mr. Waters
Correct.
reviewed that?
Correct.
You have not reviewed it.
I looked at it briefly, but I don't have detailed information on it.
Was there any description of the fact that there used to be an old gas station?
I'm aware
Oh,
that
that's
there
it.
was an old gas station there, yes.
Was there any mention by anybody on your staff about environmental considerations for an old gas station?
Objection.
What's the objection?
Well, first of all, the exhibit speaks for itself, and there is language in the exhibit 5 that mentions the voluntary cleanup program and the contamination, but this is outside the scope of the direct examination.
He can ask him if anyone on the staff mentioned the gas station. And,
So-
Mr. Hyde, I would just say that it was at my invitation that planning and zoning produced all these government officials. So you're certainly welcome to examine them as you have, but Mr. Rogers is as well, and I don't see any need to go through bringing them up a second time. Go ahead.
Thank you. Are you aware that there's a conflict in the concept of trash pickup between two separate documents in this case?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware that there's a method of trash pickup at the new Lofts location on 4th and Chesapeake where they have a bin?
Mr. Chairman, I'd object. It's not relevant.
I'm going to show that the new project's going to have the same problem.
I'll allow it.
So on the street, on Tuesday mornings, there's a whole bunch of trash bins on the street because of the density of the project. There's not one commercial bin.
Objection, it's not a question.
So are you aware that this same proposal,
That's completely different issue than what we're talking about here. We're talking about whether we have the capacity to provide trash services to this development. And it's all going to be private, so they're not going to rely on the city's trash collection system to pick up trash.
so you say you're not going to pick up trash at this site?
It's private collection.
Pardon?
It's private collection.
Private collection. Do you know that these site development plans says it's public?
I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware that the traffic study has not accommodated the trash pickup on that site?
Objection.
You can answer.
I don't understand how that has to do with the subject matter at hand.
Well, Mr. Gerald, tell me-
I'm not aware of the traffic study. I didn't get involved with the traffic study, so I don't know any of the detailed information in the traffic study. That's not part of our review process.
is it true that we have private trash collectors that have big lift the bin over the top operation?
Yes.
And then they also have little can
Yes,
pickup?
correct.
So you have both in the city. How big is that truck that lifts up over the?
I know
Pretty
the
big, pretty
dimensions
big,
of it.
pretty big.
It's large, yeah.
And you say you've not looked at the plans, but if I suggested to you that that truck has to be perpendicular across Americana, which is the main thoroughfare from Watergate, that would block the traffic.
That was
I'd
not-
object
that was
again,
not part of our
Mr. Chairman.
review.
It's beyond the scope, one, and two, it doesn't have anything to do with adequacy of public facilities.
Mr. Rogers, this witness has said he doesn't know anything about the traffic study. So why don't we confine our questions to things that he knows something about?
I was trying to get to the best practice for picking up trash at that site as the project is developed. Since he doesn't know anything about plans and he doesn't know anything about traffic, then I will stop questioning him on those subjects. Have you assured that the adequate facilities comments or reviews by your department protects the public health, safety, and welfare, and promotes general welfare of the community
Objection.
and conserves the environment?
Objection.
What's the objection?
It's outside the scope of 2216, 2218, and 2224. That is what Mr. Gerald's department has to review.
Well, it's fair enough to ask him how he takes into account, if he does it all, the purposes of the chapter that he's involved in administering. So I'll allow the answer.
Okay, well,
For those three areas that we address, which is 16, 18, and 24, Chapter 22, yes, we took that into account. The staff takes that into account, and when they send the memo up to me and brief me on the memo, we take that into account.
But there's no comment in your comments about the gas station.
No, there are not.
When I called you about the discharge of chemicals into the creek after a rain, what did you do?
We sent people out to take samples of the water to see what was causing the sheen on the top of the water. And we repeated that twice. And then we contacted MDE, who has the lead of the cleanup of that. So we contacted MDE to make sure that they were aware, which they were, because you had contacted them as well, and told them what we were doing and what the plans were, and they were satisfied with that and just asked us to provide the test results.
So did you have an emergency team put a boom on the creek?
We did.
What did the sample of your water say? What were the results?
I don't have that information, and I don't have the test results, but there was some contamination at low levels.
Do you know what MTBE
I
is?
do.
What is that?
It's an additive to gasoline normally.
Was that in the water?
I believe that it was, yeah.
You know what level is acceptable?
I don't. No. I'd have to see the test results. It lists what the allowable levels are.
Has there been any additional research as to find the source?
No. And again, that would be a question to ask MDE, because the city doesn't have the lead on that. MDE does, Maryland Department of the Environment. And so they have the lead on that cleanup and all those remediation actions.
So if I told you, have you seen the letter from the Secretary of Environment?
From April?
Yes.
Yes.
And what did the Secretary say?
I can certainly read it, or we can make it available to the board.
Well, let's just cut to the chase.
I believe it's an exhibit in his packet.
Did the Secretary say that they're waiting on a RAP, response action plan?
I believe that's what they say.
Did they also say it's restricted to commercial use?
Yeah, we
It's on the
should,
second page, top of the page.
yeah, just to read that. You express a concern that Eastport Plaza wishes to excavate the site to construct a building on a location with contaminated soil, which is currently designated for restricted commercial use.
Thank you. So
I'm not
why
finished yet.
would,
The-
that's enough.
Let him answer the question.
Unpaved area of the former gas station has not yet been paved. However, Eastport Plaza directed its environmental consultant to obtain soil samples from the area. The analytical results demonstrate that the soils present in the area serve as an acceptable soil cap over the subsurface contamination. Therefore, the soils in place in the area are currently sufficient to prevent human exposure.
So if they say it's commercial restricted, what does that mean to you?
Clearly, it's restricted to commercial purposes only and not residential.
So if you had a cleanup manual from MDE, which is published, and it had several columns in it for standards, levels of contamination, and one was for groundwater, and one was for residential use, and one was for commercial use, would you expect the commercial use specifications to be looser or less restrictive than the residential standards?
Again, this is so far afield from our review of stormwater management and of Code Section 1710 that this is an MDE issue. So MDE is going to be involved with each step of the process for this development. And if they say that it's commercial use only and that it can't be developed for any other purpose, then that's what's going to happen.
So-
you know, we have a lot of review processes yet to go, and
Thank
they
you.
have not said that yet.
Has the applicant asked for residential use?
I did not review that as part of these three.
So you don't know that there's 98 residential
No,
units?
I do know that it is. I know it's mixed use.
Thank you. So if it's restricted commercial and the applicant has submitted for residential use, and you say MDE has the lead, how can anybody here make the decision about the case until MDE has made their decision?
Because the three paragraphs in Chapter 22 that we reviewed do not address that. That's not a part of the adequate public facilities consideration.
Yes, it is. It's on the first page. It's part of the proposed purpose of adequate public facilities to protect the environment.
It's not for these.
Have you read
three
the first
portions.
page of
I
the
have.
section?
I have.
Does it say environment? I have a poster to show you what it says,
Oh.
if you'd like to look at it. So how can you go against what the state says?
We're not going against what the state says. We're looking at those three paragraphs and determining based on those and based on our responsibilities whether there's adequate public facilities.
So if you were to tell the board who is responsible for the NPDES permit in the city of Annapolis?
Who's responsible for it? The city of Annapolis is. The
But
MS4 permit.
who holds that permit authority?
I know he is. So I'm going to
I think the city as a whole does. It's a city permit.
redirect.
I think you do. Not, no?
Well, I think we carry out the projects. I think we are responsible for part of it, and I think the Office of Environmental Policy is responsible for part of it. And there's a lot of components of it. There's public outreach. There's illicit discharge. There's parts of it we're responsible for some, and other departments are responsible for other parts.
If the NPDES permit, which is delegated to the city, says that when there's a release of pollutants into the water, you've got to fill out a bunch of forms and you've got to take some action, have anybody in the city done that?
We have when there's been illicit discharges, yes.
So that release into the creek is not an illicit discharge.
Well, that's why we investigate. That's why, to be as careful as we possibly could, we put a boom around it, and that's why we took samples, and that's why we consulted with MDE.
But you didn't fill out any of those forms.
We notified them of the release.
I'm asking you a question. Did you fill out any
I don't
forms?
think we filled out any forms for that. We notified
Is
them.
the answer no?
His answer was, I don't think so.
Yeah. I'm not aware that we filled out any forms. I know that we
Thank you.
called them and we contacted them.
Okay. So the fire department referred the adequacy of fire suppression water to your department. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
As an engineer, which you are a licensed engineer,
I
right?
am.
As a civil engineer,
Yes.
would you want to use a flow certificate for one hydrant that says not for engineering use? With a little asterisk that says, basically says this results are useless.
Yeah, I would ask that our utilities engineer, Tor Burkhardt's going to testify on the water and sewer adequacy, and I would ask that you save that question for her.
But in your comments given to the planning and zoning director, you did not answer that question in your comments. You just had 3 issues, which are the 3 sections of the code you cited, but you did not answer the question for the fire department. Is that correct?
We did not answer the question for the fire department.
Because it was referred to you to answer as a 4th question.
I can't address that. I don't know the answer to that.
So you did not make a comment about that.
I'm not aware that we made a comment about that on our formal comments.
Thank you. So I'm going to repeat a question. Assume that the proposed development protects the public health and safety and welfare and promotes the general welfare of the community and conserves the environment. Did you or did you not consider that?
Objection. And the reason, Mr. Chairman, you say that the purposes clause, I don't know if this is the final ruling that you're making here, is fair game. I would like to go on record that it's not possible for the purposes clause to be reasonably considered when the directives under Chapter 22 are specific about what it is that each department has to do. You know, through the site design plan process, there are these soft issues about, you know, general welfare and things like that. There's a preamble in the purposes clause, and I suggest that it's not appropriate to try to delve into purposes clause when the specific sections under Chapter 22 direct each department as to what the standards are. I don't, it's impossible. I mean, the appellant tries to make it appear that the departments neglected their jobs. It's an aspirational section of the code, the purposes clause. It's not a directive as to what to do, and I would ask that not be permitted.
One of the important questions the board will have to decide is whether and to what extent the purposes clause needs to be addressed in the administration of the chapter. That's a valid issue, and in that context, I'd like to hear what he has to say and answer that question.
Thank you, Mr.
So we addressed the specific requirements for those 3 paragraphs. We didn't address the larger purposes. So we addressed whether there were adequate maintenance facilities, whether there was adequate water and sewer services, and whether the stormwater management met the requirements of 1710 of the city code.
No fire water comment.
Fire water is part of the water supply.
Not to determine the adequacy. Do you know how to do adequacy of fire water?
We're going to address that in just a few
All right,
minutes.
thank you. So when you read the stormwater report, did you read the stormwater report?
I looked at it.
The
I
first
didn't read it through.
The first page talks about the gas station, correct?
Yes.
If you were to try and find out anything more about the gas station, have you ever been involved in an environmental cleanup?
I have.
Have or haven't?
I have, yeah, for the federal government with the Navy.
All right, so what are the phases? Phase one?
I'm not going to be able to go through those
Phase 1, 2,
detailed
3?
description.
Phase 1, 2, 3? That's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Objection.
All right, so when you're doing a phase 1 or a phase 2, there's a required amount of research to be done. So did your department do any phase 1 or phase 2 research to validate what is in the stormwater management plan?
No.
No. Are you aware on the internet there's a fact sheet about the gas station?
I am, yeah.
Do you know what it says about being restricted?
Yeah, we've talked to MDE about it, and we got a copy of the report, so we are aware of that.
Aware of what?
Of the, basically the history of the Eastport Shopping Center and the site issues.
And there's supposed to be a RAP. And RAP was to pave the whole site. Has that been done?
It has not, and that was addressed in the MDE letter of April.
When was that supposed to have been done?
I'm not sure. Let me see.
Mr. Chairman, I'd object. The RAP has absolutely nothing to do with APF. A RAP is a response action plan that's regulated by the Maryland Department of Environment, and it just doesn't have any relevance to what Mr. Gerald's done in his department.
I understand your point, but I think it's a fair issue for Mr. Rogers to raise whether the stormwater plan that has been found to be adequate will allow the transport of known existing pollutants into the water body.
Okay.
So you can answer the question.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what the date was So the document that I received from MDE says that in October 2008, the VCP approved the proposed RAP, which include provisions for building ventilation adjustments,
Excuse me.
installation of a...
Excuse me.
Let me finish.
No, you
Subslab
can't finish.
depressurization.
You cannot, he cannot finish. This is an out-of-order
You asked a
document.
question, so I'm answering the question that you asked.
We'll let him
No,
finish.
sir. This has to be in existence on 26 November. And if he can't date that document, it can't be used.
That's your argument to make, but he can finish reading the document you refer
Well, then
to.
I move to strike.
You can do that when he's done, then you'll know how much to strike.
To date, the RAP has been implemented except for the installation of the pavement cap.
And what's the point of striking it if it's an exhibit? What's the point of striking? the
There are
testimony?
several versions of this fact sheet floating around.
Well, you'll
I-
make sure that we understand which ones are
What
what.
I'm
Mr.
asking
Chairman,
him to
can I ask a
do,
question, just so
I'm
I'm
asking
clear?
him to look
Can
at
I
the-
ask a question so I'm clear?
Exhibit
So that we're
8.
talking about the same exhibit and the same letter? This is the April 29th letter from MDEP.
This
MDE.
was a fact sheet that was produced by MDE.
From the MDE.
Yeah.
Is that
It's
my
not the
Exhibit
letter,
8?
it's not the,
Is that my Exhibit 8?
I don't know what your
So
Exhibit 8 is.
it's your Exhibit 8?
My Exhibit 8 was done shortly after the decision.
So it's your
And
exhibit?
It's a different fact sheet.
And you don't want it included,
No, not that one.
but it's your exhibit?
My exhibit's already part of the appeal.
Right.
All right, let's move on.
So this brings up another point, Mr. Chair, that I request that you limit presentation and use of documents that were not part of the decision process on or before the 26th of November 2018. That will save a lot of difficult times.
Well, I suggest you make the objection when a document you have a problem with is offered. But I would point out, as we determined on June 4th, this is a de novo hearing. So we'll decide, it's our job, regrettably, to decide whether an adequate public facility certification is justified.
However, I will add to your comment that the applicant and the appellee have submitted their case and submitted their evidence. That's new evidence. They cannot do that.
Yes, they can. Sorry, but that's the way it is.
But there's no basis for the decision on that piece of paper.
There's going to be a new decision.
I object.
Objection noted. All right, any more questions for Mr. Jarrell?
Mr. Jarrell, in order for the gas station site to be dug into, drained through, dirt turned, any kind of disturbance, what is the final resolution document that has to be received before anybody can touch the dirt on that site?
So 2 points. Number one, we're not handling that project, so I don't know the answer to that. That's an MDE project. Number two, we did not take that contamination into account. As I stated before, in our review of the adequate public facilities for stormwater, we looked at Code Section 1710 to make sure that there was compliance with that. That's what the basis of our adequate public facilities approval was.
So you are suggesting to the planning and zoning director, by your certificate of adequate public facilities, which includes the environment and the stormwater management plan, you are suggesting that they can move forward on a permit process to dig and excavate that site
I don't
without
think we, I don't think
proper
we are.
closure.
I don't think we are stating that because MDE is responsible for that project, not the city.
Who issues the permits in the city of Annapolis?
Planning and zoning.
So they've just approved the first step, have they not?
They haven't approved any permits yet for this
No,
project.
the first step in the permit process.
They approved the first step, which specifically has standards that have to be met, and those were met for the 3 sections that we review, and the contamination will come later. MDE is going to have to be involved with this project and with the permitting of this project, clearly. But those don't come into play with the specific standards of the 3 paragraphs that we address.
Do you think there's a conflict between the city and MDE on this subject?
No.
So how is this going to get resolved?
How is what going to get resolved?
The fact that they're in charge and you're not.
They're going to have to be involved with the permitting process, and until they are satisfied with the status of the site, there won't be permits issued. They've got to be involved with this site.
So if this site is commercial restricted, and MDE has to approve, before any permits can be issued, approve the environmental pollution standards.
If in fact they have a restriction on...
So why are we going forward with this until that's done?
Why not?
All right. The statute says you have to get the APF certificate first. That's why we're here. Anything else for Mr. Jarrell?
No, thank you.
Questions from the board?
Mr. Chairman, just a quick, just going back to the standards themselves, just to make sure that I'm following properly. In the 3 specific sections for which you are charged under the city code to review for an adequate public facilities responsibility, in 2216, it's your contention that you have adhered to the standards that are found in 2216-040 that refer to 2208-010. So this certificate, the application complies with that?
With
For
2260.
adequate public maintenance services. So the snow removal, the road keep, the trash removal. And your
Right.
contention is in your testimony that there'll be private trash service.
Correct.
It'll be private snow removal.
Private streets.
And private streets.
They'll have all maintenance, including snow removal, pothole repairs, everything.
In 2218, the criteria and certification for adequate water and sewer facilities, there are no exemptions to that. The standards required that you follow all of those in 2218-040A and all the subsections through 2. By your letter and your testimony, you say that your review indicates
Correct.
from your staff that this is
Yeah, and Ms. Burkhart's going to address that in
right,
detail.
and I will ask those questions to
Correct.
her, some
Yes.
questions that were raised. But also in 2224, the stormwater management facilities, again, it's your view and your testimony that it does adhere as it was submitted to you for review, that in the respects of the criteria provided in 22.24, that it adheres to those requirements.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Walsh, no questions.
All right. Mr. Jarrell referring to, I guess it's 16. Sorry, I'm a little slow. You have the authority to set standards, is that right?
Yes.
It says standards for public maintenance services shall be determined by the Director of Public Works.
Correct.
Have you done that?
So we review these on a case-by-case basis. Generally, the requirements are for anything associated with the streets, so that's pothole repairs, resurfacing as needed, snow removal, and trash collections. So those are the things we look for to see if we have adequate services available for each development that comes before us. Since these are all private services, those don't require any services from my department.
So if Mr. Rogers made a Public Information Act request for standards under 2016, there'd be nothing to give him?
I don't think we have a SOP or anything like that now. We have a single reviewer of those, and she takes those things into account.
In 2210, .010 says in determining adequacy of public or inadequacy of public facilities, departments responsible, you're one of those, shall take into consideration the following, and it lists 4 different things. D is the capital improvement program. To what extent did Public Works take into account the capital improvement program in making any of these determinations?
Yeah, we determined whether there would be any requirements for city capital projects to provide adequate public facilities for this development, and there is no such requirement.
You determined that none was necessary.
Right.
And it says you'll also take into consideration the comprehensive plan. To what extent did you take the comprehensive plan into account?
I'm not sure that we did in those 3 sections that we considered. And 24, the section on standards under 24 says, the standards required to be promulgated pursuant to 2208-010 shall include but not be limited to a requirement that the proposed project complies with the provisions of 1710. So it says include but not be limited to. Has your department added anything to those requirements? We had not as of November when we did the memo. We have added to it since then. We've increased the treatment standards that are required for the stormwater treatment.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So the question that's been floating around here is, to what extent is it your job to consider whether, when you consider the adequacy of the stormwater plan, whether implementation of the plan as proposed in the conditions that you know exist will convey known pollutants into Back Creek?
Right. Right. So what we look at under 1710 is the amount of water that's going to be treated on site, treated as far as retained on site and run through a filter and so forth, and then discharged. So if we know that a particular area is actively flowing into our storm drain system and then polluting the waters, that's sort of even a separate issue, right, from the development. That's something that is a current issue that should be dealt with. We've had no indications from MDE saying that the city should be taking action. Even when we had the reports of the sheen on the water, and we reported that to MDE, and we placed booms to be very safe to make sure that it was contained, they felt like it was a natural phenomenon and was not due to the site conditions. The testing that we did, in fact, showed MTBE, and so there is some pollutant there, but not at an action level that they expect the city to respond and do a major cleanup. Conversely, at Bates Middle School, there's currently an issue with fuel oil being released, and that's an active site that MDE is actively pursuing with the school system to get that corrected. If this situation was the same at Eastport, they would insist that we do a similar action to that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, just one more question.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, just so I sequentially understand, so if this were, I read the April 29th letter and its conclusion, just so I'm sure sequentially how this works, that MDE has jurisdiction, and if this certificate of adequate public facilities were to go forward, and they'd be looking for a multi-use purpose here as opposed to simply a commercial purpose, so clearly it includes residential, that would change, and MDE would have to take a second look at, a new look at what's being proposed and see if it's compliant with the stormwater regulations?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah. I would think so.
So this, still before a permit can be issued, MDE has, from the city, MDE has to weigh in as to what will happen?
Correct.
Just so I'm clear in my head.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Hyatt?
Thank you. Mr. Gerald, referring you to the April 29th letter, the first paragraph on the second page, would you read that out loud?
Sure. With respect to oil contamination from the former gas station property, in December 2006, the gas station was raised and 4 underground storage tanks and 442 tons of impacted soil were removed from the site. In July 2009, the department's oil control program closed this case for the gas station based on the finding that the residual soil and groundwater contamination of the site did not constitute a complete exposure pathway. On March 13, 2019, the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, MEMA, received a report of an alleged discharge of oil into Back Creek. According to MEMA's report, this matter, according to the department's oil control program and the emergency response division, a brittle sheen is indicative of a naturally occurring phenomenon caused by bacteria reacting to the presence of minerals in the water.
And this letter was from the Secretary of the Maryland Department of Environment addressed to Mr. Rogers, right?
Correct.
So the Secretary was responding to Mr. Rogers' complaint.
Correct.
And then with regard to the status of whether this is restricted for commercial purposes, the letter does go on to say on that second page toward the bottom that in September of 2016, the applicants submitted a revised VCP application for the site requesting a future residential property use, right?
Correct.
So in the chronology of events, the applicant must first obtain a certificate of adequacy, and of course already has obtained site design approval, and ultimately the MDE has to approve a mixed use on this site as well. Isn't that true?
Right. That's the same thing we just answered here.
Right. I just want to be clear. And at this stage, the request for certification for adequacy is would you agree that it's a pretty preliminary type matter?
Oh, it's very much preliminary. It's the first step, as Mr. Rogers depicted.
And the whole business of pursuing permits and working with the MDE, that would take place subsequently.
Yes.
And that would assure that there would be no contamination to the extent there's any contamination that could migrate. Your department will make sure that there is no migration of contamination into the outfall. Is that right?
Correct. And MDE.
And MDE. And then one last question. You looked at the drawing, the 27-inch drawing, the 27-inch pipe, and on the city plans it showed 24-inch pipe. Could it be that the city plan is not correct? I mean, if Bay Engineering did a survey and found that it was actually 27 inch in the field, could that be the case?
Yeah, I don't know. It could be. That's conceivable.
But that's also investigated further at permit time?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That concludes my redirect.
Thank you, Mr. Jarrett.
Thank you.
No, I'd like to recross.
All right, if you must.
If Mr. Elson has nothing.
Thank you. I vote for you in this direction.
Thank you, Mr. Elgin.
I don't have any questions, Mr. Jarrell, at this point, but I would like to reserve the possibility of questions based on the cost.
Mr. Jarrell, are you aware of a 1963 drawing by Macrone Engineering that shows the 42-inch pipe underneath the tennis courts, which discharges into the creek, has a drop of 4 feet without any provision for a manhole?
I've heard about that from you, but I'm not
Would you like to see the
intimately
drawing?
aware of it.
I have
No,
a copy.
I don't need to see a drawing. I know we're televising that, in the process of televising to see what the situation is with
So
that.
you and I discussed that and said the best way to find out if that stormwater pipe is not adequate or has been put together incorrectly, we probably should find out, and you agreed that you would TV the
I
pipe.
agreed that we would televise it for the current situation. Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
mean, we expect that there will be less stormwater discharged into that in the future after this development. So that doesn't really play into this discussion, but I'm
So-
concerned about the current conditions out there.
But the adequacy of the pipe, if there is a difficulty, or it's not a technical term, but if there is a major interruption in the flow in the pipe, where one pipe is below the other pipe by 4 feet and there's no explanation for that, would you want to know that?
We want to know it, yeah. That's why we're televising the line.
Thank you. So, in the stormwater management plan, the applicant did a great job in calculating all the tributary areas, did an exhaustive study. And they accommodated in their calculations like 10% extra flow for joints in the pipe having water infiltrate into the middle of the pipe system. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Is it good engineering practice?
Well, yeah, it definitely is good engineering practice, but I don't know if they,
Okay, well, they
I don't know if
did.
they did that or not.
So if this current 24-inch pipe runs right through the middle of the gas station site where the contamination is, would you expect to have some infiltration, the contamination into that pipe?
The contamination is a separate issue that I think we've beat to death. Possibly, but
If, Mr. Jarrell, if you own the stormwater management pipe and you are delivering contaminants into the bay, you are responsible along with the source.
Objection.
Is that correct?
That's a legal question, Mr.
All
Roberts.
right. I'm not legal, so I'm sorry. I
Well, the
apologize.
point is that the witness is not, so.
Oh, all right. So, but you will agree that there may be infiltration.
if there is contamination, so that's the first thing. If there is contamination, which MDE apparently doesn't think that there's any pathways, but if there is, and then if there is infiltration, then there would be some concern.
So I would like to offer you an opportunity. If you say MDE doesn't think there's any pathways, I'm going to offer for you to read all the pathways in Exhibit 18. And you're welcome to do it because in my presentation, I only gave an example because this was too bulky. And both the applicant and you and planning and zoning are welcome to read all these reports and read all the pathways and the 16 pollution elements that are in the ground. You're welcome to do that.
Thank you.
So you may change your belief,
But he's not going to do it tonight, so let's keep going.
but if you would like to do that, I
Thank
offer
you.
that
I
too.
appreciate that offer.
Are you aware in the MDE standards, since you're referring all this environmental stuff to them, if there's a category in their cleanup standards for mixed use?
I'm not aware of those now. I'm not aware of what the standards are.
Well, if you go to my exhibit, which is the Maryland Stormwater Cleanup Manual for soil and groundwater, there is no column for mixed use. So as of 26 November, if all the tests, all the studies for the site restrict this to commercial, and there's no mixed-use standard, how can the applicant apply for mixed use?
I would object. I think that's also a question. Sorry. I would object also because I think it requires it requires an answer to it.
How is that related to any of his answers on redirect?
There is a mixing of authorities between the city, his review of the stormwater management plan, and the standards by which they made the MDE made their restrictions and have put in the fact sheet and the secretary's letter. If they're submitting a plan that does not fall into the laws and the guidelines, mixed use being that new idea, then there has to be some authority in the law that looks at the contaminants with respect to misuse.
I don't remember the mixed-use issue coming up on the redirect examination. Your recross is limited to what was discussed in redirect.
Well, it's not residential and it's not commercial.
I understand that's your view. Anything else for Mr.
Now we're in a
Jarrell?
black hole.
Is there anything else for Mr. Jarrell?
No, thank you.
Real briefly, Mr. Gerald. There was a question that was posed to you just now. If there is contamination and infiltration, there would be a concern. But as of right now, do you know if MDE is determined if there is contamination and infiltration?
I'm not aware that they've
Objection.
determined that.
He's already said he doesn't know what MDE is doing.
You may answer the question.
I'm not aware that they have made that determination.
Okay. And another question is posed to you, which the form of it indicated that you were referring all of this to MDE. Is that a correct statement? That you were referring the contamination issue?
No, they've been involved with this process for years. So no, we didn't refer it to them. It's within their authority and responsibilities.
As far as you know, has MDE been aware of this since at least 2006?
Yes.
Okay. And what are, regarding the use of the term sheen, first of all, can you indicate what that means?
Yeah, it's normally an oily type substance that's on top of the water. So oil's lighter than water, so it stays on the top of the water and has normally colors to it.
And in this case, when the testing was done, was the sheen observed as far as you know?
Sheen was observed, and that's why we put the boom around the area and why we took samples.
What does the boom do?
The boom contains the oily substance. If that's what it is, it contains it to within the area that the boom surrounds.
Okay. Does the city actually have a boom, or did the city have to hire
It's
a
just
contractor?
materials. It's a material that you put on top of the water to contain
Just-
it. It's not a piece of equipment. It's just
material.
materials. Yeah.
Okay. And were you given the measurements of the sheen? In other words, roughly the square footage that it.
I don't know what it was now.
Okay. Would Mr. Waters know that?
No.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
I believe you're dismissed.
Thank you.
I'm going to call Tora Burkhart as my next witness.
Good evening.
Good evening.
tell the board who you are and your business address, please?
Yes, I'm Tora Burkhart, and I'm at 145 Foreman Street on the second floor, Public Works.
And what do you do in the Department of Public Works?
So I'm an engineer responsible for pretty much everything that has to do with water and sewer.
Are you involved in the process of determining whether a project satisfies adequacy of public facilities with regard to sewer and water?
I am.
Have you seen what has been labeled as the applicant's exhibit number 4, the adequate public facility study for the lofts at Eastport Landing prepared by Bay Engineering? I referred to that during Mr. Jarrell's testimony. Have you seen that before?
I have.
Have you reviewed that?
I have.
Okay. Directing your attention to chapter 22.18 of the city code, did your department consider whether there was adequate water and sewer facilities for this project at lofts at Eastport Landing?
We did.
Was part of that review and assessment as to whether there would be what is known as adequate storage in the water facilities to satisfy the American Water Works Association?
Yes, the city did a water and sewer study that was completed in 2014, and that study demonstrated that the city had adequate storage capacity in its system.
So the study from 2014 confirms that there is
and continues to be.
Okay, all right. Was part of the review and assessment as to whether there would be adequate fire flow to the property with the minimum residual pressure that's in compliance with the city code?
Yes.
Tell the board what, as succinctly as you can without getting into a whole lot of calculations or engineering detail, but make it clear how is it that you make that determination?
Okay. So basically, we start with the information that comes from the Bay Engineering report. It gives us flows for water and sewer. It also gives us locations that the intent of the connections are to be made to both the water and sewer systems, and that information is used in conjunction with the city's water and sewer hydraulic models. So it's a Bentley. Water GEMS and sewer GEMS are the names of the models. These hydraulic models are used to evaluate water and sewer in slightly different ways. The water model is used in conjunction with the fire flow test results that are provided by the applicant. So there's sort of 3 steps to the model process. The first is that we look at the static pressure. We look at what the observed static pressure was, and we compare that to what the model says the observed static pressure would be. I mean, the modeled static pressure. So those two are compared, and assuming they're reasonably close, which they were in this case, we move on to the second step. We enter the information that basically the background information of what was occurring at the time, how full were our water tanks in our system, whether there was a pump on at the water treatment plant. We input that information along with the fire flow, observed fire flow results, and we check the residual pressure at that same location. When we check the residual pressure, we determine whether it closely resembles what was observed. The third step, we don't use any of the data that is provided by the applicant. We're simply running the model to look at fire flow capacity. And the way that's done is that there is basically the model can run multiple locations at the same time. You put in the restriction of 20 pounds per square inch residual pressure throughout the system, and you determine what the flow rate is for each of the nodes. So when we did that for this project, the node that the fire flow test was taken at had a flow of about 2,500, just under 2,500 gallons per minute at the 20 pounds per square inch residual pressure. For sewer, we take the data that we received from the applicant regarding their peak flow that they have determined. We take the background information in the model of the maximum daily flow combined with a wet weather flow, and we add the peak flow from the applicant and compare that to the capacity in the system itself. And again, the sewer system was adequate.
Have you seen Mr. Jarrell's memo from November 13th, 2018? That's the Exhibit 1D that I referred to that states this project has adequate public facilities, including water and sewer facilities.
I have.
And you agree with that? You concur with Mr. Jarrell on that one? And then directing your attention to the code 22.18.040 sets forth the standards, right? And under A, 1 and 2. Is it your opinion that this project satisfies those standards based on your independent testing and based upon what was submitted by the applicant?
It is.
Thank you. That concludes my direct examination of this witness.
Thank you. Mr. Elson.
I don't have any questions of this witness. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Burkhardt,
Yes.
do you know what NFPA is?
Yes.
Are you aware that there's tables in the NFPA documents to determine the required flow for a building of a certain type?
Can you tell us what it is, Mr. Rogers? Or are you going to ask the witness what it is?
I'm asking if they use that document.
Yeah, but members of the board would like to know what the document is. We don't want to read it. We don't even need to see it.
I'll put you to sleep.
We just need a brief explanation of what it is.
This is the fire code, and in there it talks about
It's a fire code put out by a national group.
national group which the city is supposed to comply with. Did you look at the state fire code?
So we review, in Public Works, we review the water system and its capacity to provide adequate water for the project. We do not address on-site fire protection and suppression systems. That is handled in
My question
fire
to you
department.
was, did you look at the state fire code requirements?
No.
Is it required in the city code to do that?
Not for the part that I am responsible for. For Public Works, we're looking at the water system and the adequacy of the water system as it relates to the applicant and fire flow
So I
through our
apologize.
water system.
I apologize, that was a trick question because I asked Mr. Jarrell earlier if he had commented on the referral from the fire marshal to your department. And then he said you were going to answer that question.
Okay, so
And you have not answered that question.
So specifically, what is the item that you are referring to? Are you talking about, I understand that in 2212 there's a reference to fire flow. So as far as the water system goes, the water system has adequate water to meet the fire flow to the site.
Well, this is a lot more complicated than we can talk about tonight. But there is a D rating available in the code if you put sprinklers in a building. but you still have to determine the total requirement at some level in the beginning, on a macro level, in order to say the 12-inch pipe going down Chesapeake Avenue is really great and it's going to be sufficient, or the 6-inch pipe going down Americana, or the 4-inch pipe going down Norman, that they're all adequate for fire protection.
Right, and as far as what is in the public system, my assessment is that they are adequate.
So did you
And
make
then,
a
so
mi-
if
did you
there's
make a
de-
did you make a mistake by accepting the fire flow data sheet because it said you can't use it? Are you aware of the note on that piece of paper that says
So-
not to be used for engineering purposes?
As I mentioned before, the ultimate decision on whether there's adequacy for fire flow has no bearing on what that fire flow test says. The only purpose for the fire flow test for Public Works is to
Is it in your package?
make sure that the observations for static and residual pressure and flow rate are similar to what we are finding in the water model. The water model is the ultimate item that we use to decide whether there's adequate water.
So is
the water model?
is the water model tapped into the system real time?
It is a system that can run with dynamically, in the sense that you can run extended period simulations and that sort of thing.
So you're not,
But we don't update
the
it.
water model is not real data.
It is updated when there's a change to our system.
So if the
it's
pressure
for the
that was
public
given to you
system.
on the flow sheet, if the pressure given to you on the flow sheet is 50 psi or 54 psi,
Mm-hmm.
and then the static is obviously going to be a little bit lower when you're flowing, those numbers, if it says you can't use them,
Static is not when it's flowing. The point of static pressure is to get that first background bit of information. So if you understand fire flow
so
tests,
then the residual is the number you want to use.
the residual is important because you take the difference between you model the difference between the static and the residual, and that's how you are able to calculate what the final fire flow is
Okay, so I
at
understand
that pressure.
I got that, but maybe they don't. But suppose I told you in the NFPA book, there's a table. First, you have to figure out the classification of the building. Do you know what classification the building is?
No, because that's not my expertise.
1,
I'm
2, or
dealing
3?
with the water system.
Okay.
In the public water system.
This gets to how much water flow you've got to have. That table says you need 3745 gallons per minute in a class 1, 2, 3 building with X residual pressure.
And so there are circumstances where an applicant will need to provide booster pumps, is my understanding. But as far as the adequacy of the public system as it sits in the right-of-way, there is adequate water for this
So,
project.
as an engineer, maybe trying to be a little conservative about your comments, would you stipulate maybe pumping on the site should be considered based on, in the final design, something like that?
Those are the sorts of things that get reviewed, my understanding is, by the fire department during the grading permit and building permit process.
So there's also an opportunity to derate the fire flow from that table that I just cited,
Okay?
because they're going to sprinkle the building. So that helps them. But do you know how much a sprinkler uses when it's activated? How many gallons per minute?
That's not my area of expertise.
So-
I am dealing
so
with the
let-
public
okay,
system,
so-
water system.
So if you want to really know the answer to this, would you like to see the applicant hire a FPE, a fire protection engineer, to give you the real answers so then you could go back into your model?
I review the public aspect of this. At the time of a subsequent review of the sprinkler engineer, and at that time, if there's some change that would be made to the public water system, I would want to know that, but
So when we do these APF reviews, you don't want to drill down into the detail too much. But don't you think you ought to go to enough of a level that you have reached the satisfaction that if a sprinkler uses 100 gallons per minute and the fire hydrant's running at 2,500 gallons per minute, and then they want to open the other fire hydrant at, by the way, did you know that the fire hydrant that they tested is only good for 1425?
if you're referring to the results at the pressure at the hydrant, that's a different thing than what is commonly looked at, which is the residual pressure of 20 pounds per square inch. I'm going to say PSI, that is pounds per square inch.
Do you know what a green top hydrant is?
I do.
So how many?
I do. It depends on the jurisdiction as to how that's applied, but
in
yes.
Annapolis,
Yes.
what is a green top hydrant capacity?
What it tells me is that at the time of the test, the hydrants were painted a long time ago. The color coding system was done a long time ago, and I was not here at that time. But my understanding of how the city applies that is the actual measured, observed fire flow at the time that they did the test in order to determine the color. And that is between 1,000 and 1,500 gallons per minute.
I agree.
Right, but that is at a pressure of 52 pounds per square inch. When you extrapolate that to the 20 psi minimum residual pressure requirement, you come up with the 2,500 gallons per minute per our model.
No, you come up with less. Less
No.
pressure, less flow.
No. It's to keep a minimum of 20 psi residual anywhere in the city's water system. So we are modeling 20 psi at every single, when you apply the model, you apply a flow rate at each node, and there's many nodes in the model system. You apply that flow at every node, and when you get to the point where it causes any node in the system to go below 20 psi, then that is the flow rate that is available at that hydrant. In this case, it was just under 2,500 gallons per minute per the water model.
Ms. Burkhardt, if the hydrant is only designed for 1,400 gallons per minute,
it's not designed for 1,400 gallons per minute. That's at that pressure. That's how much the static flow that or flow through that nozzle is coming through.
How many hydrants were tested when they did this flow test?
How many flow tests were completed?
No, how many hydrants were simultaneously flowed in that loop around the shopping center?
My understanding there was one flow hydrant and one gauge hydrant.
I agree with you. So suppose a fire truck rolls up, lays the hose out, they're running to the site with a hose, another fire hydrant around the block on Norman Drive, they hook up to that hydrant, and then the one by the post office, they hook up to that one, and all of a sudden you've got 3 hoses running. Don't you think you'd want to test all 3 hydrants at the same time?
That's not how it's commonly done. The standards are laid out very clearly in AWWA, which is American Water Works Association, as well as NFPA, I believe, addresses the same methods of doing fire flow tests.
So I interviewed a fire protection engineer who couldn't come tonight. He told me you flow as many hydrants as you can.
What that person's
That's going to be inadmissible.
Okay, sorry.
You can ask a hypothetical.
So if I had three hydrants flowing, what do you think the PSI residual would be?
I could model that, but again, in terms of this is a node, okay? And this is only telling you what your capacity is as it relates to the requirements of 2,000 gallons per minute at 20 pounds per square inch. That doesn't mean that they are flowing 2,500 gallons out of that hydrant. And my understanding, this would be a question for the fire department, but that's extremely rare that you would flow that amount out of one hydrant. So my understanding is you could have multiple hydrants involved and be flowing out of the multiple hydrants and still not get the pressure to be the residual pressure to go below 20 pounds per square inch.
Do you think that it would be helpful to do a couple iterations on your model?
The way that we run the model is very typical, my understanding in the industry, is how you run a fire flow test.
Ms. Burkhart, I've designed water systems.
Objection.
And I can tell you that
Objection.
Mr. Rogers.
We don't need his life story.
Your opinions are
I'll
not,
give it to you later.
are not relevant. Ask a question.
So you have a model situation, and you have one hydrant with, it was 1,200 PSI, gallons per minute? What was the one hydrant flowing?
The fire flow test, are you talking about the
1245.
fire flow test itself? I'd have to look at
1245?
that to get the exact number, but
I think it was 1245.
I see 1208.
I'm sorry,
Bottom of the
1208.
fire flow test.
Okay. Do you know that the fire hydrant has 3 different types of openings?
Yes.
Called an orifice? So which is the best kind to have?
The fire flow tests themselves, which I did not attend, this specific one, but I see that it references.
Let me interrupt you, Mr. Rogers. I don't want you to lose the board, and I think you're losing me. Let me tell you where you're losing me. First of all, they told us that because of the exception for sprinklered buildings, they basically get a pass.
That's not true.
But you can argue that all you want. They also told us that they asked Public Works, Fire Department asked Public Works to provide them with information on flows for fire purposes. So I don't think we've yet heard what was asked for and what the response was. That would be very helpful.
I agree with you. So how do we answer the question?
I wasn't here for that questioning. Is that, what was?
I think Mr. Jarrell said that the fire department asked Public Works, or relied on Public Works, maybe that's what he said, for information regarding flow of water for fire suppression purposes. And Mr. Jarrell said you would be the person who would be able to talk about what the response of Public Works was to that request.
Okay, so my understanding is that the fire department during the permitting phase involves a fire suppression engineer to address, and what they do is they take the data that has been provided to them from the fire flow test, but also we can provide them with the model results so that they have good background for designing the fire suppression system. So we are providing the data of pressure and
Mr. Rogers.
Don't interrupt him.
fire flow, gallons per minute, and pressure at the site, and we can We can run multiple iterations for them, but that's during the permitting phase.
So, but what, did you provide information to the fire department?
I didn't directly. But
do you know of anyone in Public Works who
they
did?
attend the fire flow test, so they have the information regarding the fire flow test. As far as we provide them with information with respect to storage, reserve capacity. I think there's an item that deals with duration. We provide that information. If the suppression engineer needs information regarding an extended period simulation, we can do that for them with the model. But that's not during this phase, is my understanding.
So as far as you know, you didn't specifically provide them with any information directly relating to this case?
Not to my knowledge, but it may have occurred.
So, Ms. Burkhart, in what you did you look at the proposed adequate public facilities with regard to public health, safety, and welfare, and promoting the general welfare of the community and conserving the environment?
I focus on 2218. That is the area that I am assigned.
Is fire
related to water and
safety?
sewer.
Is fire water safety?
Yes, as it relates to the water distribution system.
So you did do part of this?
I did look at the fire flow capacity and determined that it met 2218, which requires 2,000 gallons per minute at a minimum of residual pressure of 20 pounds per square inch, yes.
But you didn't use the tables in NFPA?
Because that is the next step, not the step that I'm being asked to address as part of adequate public facilities.
Does that determine flow out of the NFPA? If you went down the tables and did all the hocus pocus they want you to do, is that going to help you with flow?
As far as what happens for specific buildings, the line where Public Works and the other departments end is the property line. I am providing the system requirements. We are agreeing that the water system as a whole has adequate water protection to provide water to address 2218. And if there is additional requirements that are required by the fire department that are specific to the needs that somehow bring us below that number, then that's something that would get worked out during the permitting phase.
Okay, so I'm not going to ask you the question because you weren't here to hear the fire marshal say that he's not going to do that, but somebody else is. So I'm not going to ask you that question.
All right, this is a good time to take a short break.
Thank you.
Let's resume in 10 minutes, please.
I still have questions of the...
I'm sure you do.
You want some water? That's yours. Do you think she answered the question?
It seemed like a lot of dodging. No.
I still don't know the answer.
No.
And they're using their freaking answer.
Check the front door.
So you're getting old, man. Maybe we need to open the windows or something.
you may continue.
Mr. Ricard, did you do a model on sanitary sewer adequacy?
We did the hydraulic model. We ran the hydraulic model, yes.
You used a channel roughness flow value of 0.093.
I believe that actually most of, it depends on the pipe in your system, and the hydraulic model, when it was constructed and finished in 2014, they used methods to determine what the Manning's coefficient was for the pipes.
What's the effect of using a different number?
It depends on the age of the system, the roughness of the pipes in the system.
So a higher number means you'll be able to flow less.
So we're talking about sewer again, right?
Sewer.
And there's multiple different equations that are used. I'm not recalling at this time which way it goes, but
We're talking about
it matters. Manning's.
You didn't answer my question.
I think she said she didn't know.
I'm not remembering off the top of my head which way it goes, whether it's up or down, depending on the. I don't do these calculations every day. I'd have to refresh my memory on that.
Okay? So you believe that the sewer capacity is adequate if you add 98 residential units and some number of retail stores,
Correct.
cameras, and more. That this study says everything is okay.
Correct. And the model does as well.
And glad
Mm-hmm.
the model.
Yep. The model gets calibrated at the beginning of the
Mr.
process.
Rogers, you have your
Objection.
mic on?
Okay.
I didn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
He was commenting, and this goes on and on and on if that commenting is allowed.
Let's hear the question.
The question was, did she know if they used a larger N factor on the pipe in the model or in her manual calculations, if that meant there was less flow available or more flow? And she answered, I believe, that she couldn't remember.
I can't remember that formula right now. That's all built into the model, though. I can't remember which way it goes, if the N factor is higher, whether that restricts the flow further or the other way around. I just don't remember at this point in time.
So like all the other studies in adequate public facilities, they have terms in the traffic study called background, which means future opportunity areas. How much, did you analyze how much extra capacity is left after this development is put in?
We didn't do that calculation, but with the model, we don't look at full pipe flow. So in other words, if the response from the model had been that a downstream pipe was flowing full, 100% full, then this would not have passed. There's a criteria, I believe it's 85% of the actual depth of flow to the diameter of the pipe. That criteria is built into the model in that it says that there is a problem if it exceeds that value and it's not full pipe flow.
But there's no percent in this table of what capacity is left.
What
This is
table are
just-
you
this is
referring
just-
to?
This is page 6 of the APF study. Page 6 doesn't say what percent of the capacity. It just says the capacity number.
Page 6.
Do you know what the capacity usage is?
Okay, where are you, you're referring to the table?
The table at the top of page 6.
Right,
That's water and sewer conclusion,
right,
that the 8-inch pipe is adequate.
right. If you look at, they've calculated the capacity in the pipe, and then they're comparing that to the average daily flow plus the previously allocated flow, and they're coming up with the numbers, say, for instance, in manhole 6, of 34 gallons per minute versus the capacity of 705 gallons per minute. That's in their system.
Is this just for this new development proposed? Or does this include
These
water main?
manholes are listed for this project, new manholes as part of this project. So these are the on-site manholes.
So how do
We are reviewing the downstream data using the hydraulic model.
So your model covers the total public facility capacity.
Correct.
And what is that number?
So it is, this flow is added to our existing flows that are generated when we develop the model. You build the model by taking the water flows and applying to them to the location that they come into the system. You apply a factor for inflow and infiltration, you apply multiple factors, and that is the flow that's going to each of the drainage areas.
Is it not the responsibility of an applicant to address the adequate public facilities, period?
They
That
can,
their flow plus all the other flow coming into that pipe?
we are addressing
No.
the public
I
system.
want you to answer my question.
I'm not sure I understand
Is it
your
their
question.
responsibility to present to you in their study
Yep,
their flow they want to add,
right,
added to the existing flow from the city
right.
to prove that the city's public facility is adequate?
They cannot do that because they don't have the data that we have in the hydraulic model. So all they can do is tell us what they are adding, what they are going to add as in terms of a peak flow. So what they have done here is added what peak additional flow is going to be flowing to our system. And then we input that data in the downstream manhole. In this case, I believe, if I remember correctly, manhole, there's a new segment of sewer proposed that's going to replace an existing segment of city sewer.
Is that in the city street?
I believe it's proposed to be in the street. Again, that's part of the next process, however. But the downstream manhole, I believe, is at the intersection of, it's in Americana Drive, and it crosses Americana Drive and then goes cross-country in the public sewer system. That downstream manhole is where we add this peak flow to our existing modeled flow for the rest of the
I'm
city.
going to ask the big question. This study is not a complete adequate public facility study by itself, is it, or is it not?
It is used in conjunction with our modeling information to make a determination as to whether the project meets adequacy for public facilities.
Do you intend, at the
for sewer.
Public Works Department, to publish an adequate public facilities report?
I'm not understanding what you're...
This is only a piece.
But the certificate tells you that we have gone through the process of reviewing this in conjunction with the information that the city has to indicate whether or not the site meets adequacy of public facilities as it relates to water and sewer. We have done that. And we've done that with the modeling data that the city invested in so that we could address these sorts of projects.
So your answer is you're not publishing a complete adequate public facilities.
That's not the responsibility of our department, is my
Thank you.
understanding.
No more questions.
Chairman, I have a few. please. Thank you. So, Ms. Burkhart, have you done any adequate public facilities reviews where the applicant failed to meet the standards?
Yes.
Okay. What was the most recent one? Not what, when was the most recent one?
I would say it was at least 2 years ago.
Okay. And so when, and did you fail the applicant on your part of the review? And is
We
that-
required it to be mitigated.
Okay. And did you go through the same type of analysis, testing and analysis that you did here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And when you say you required it to be mitigated, what do you mean? What happens when there's a failure?
So there's a number of ways that it can fail. In this instance, it was related to static water pressure. It was not a sewer failure. So I have not failed any sewer APFs. Mm-hmm. But there was a water one, and it was more related to the elevation. So it's a little bit hard to explain, but if you're at a high point in the city, you can have more issues with the pressure that you have because our tanks are at a fixed elevation, right? So if you're lower in the city, you've got a lot more water pressure to reach your site. In this instance, there was an issue with the static pressure.
Okay. And in this case that we're here for tonight,
Mm-hmm.
there was no issue with static pressure, is that correct?
Correct.
And I'd like to ask you about try to clear up the issue in as briefly a way as possible about fire flow versus fire suppression and who reviews what and when.
Right.
Could you just get, in 25 words or less, as they say, can you give me the difference between fire flow and fire suppression? Who reviews what and when?
Okay. So 2218 is referring to the water system and how that water system can support the putting out a fire in terms of hydrant capacity and the ability of the fire department to come to the facility and get water on the fire through the water system. As far as fire suppression goes, that is the sprinkler system, and that is a specialty engineering task that is not covered under 2218.
Okay, and who does the fire suppression analysis in the city?
So that's not my area of expertise, but
well, I'm just asking
my understanding, who does the reviews for fire suppression?
Not what person, but what, division of the city.
Right. So my understanding is that the fire marshal's office has a fire suppression engineer consultant who reviews the sprinkler designs. And
fire suppression is something that takes into consideration features on the site of the project, is that right?
Correct.
And what you said, if I may try to clarify, is that you are not involved, or it is not your role to review on-site features, is that correct?
Correct.
And what you do, if I may clarify, is to test from off-site, and part of your testing involves hydrants. Is that right?
Correct.
And you said you tested one. I think you said you tested 2 times, not 2 times. I mean, one fire hydrant for fire flow.
The way it works is you actually have a fire flow hydrant, and then you have a gauge hydrant. So you're trying to determine the residual pressure, and you have to have a second hydrant to determine that residual pressure.
And I assume these are hydrants that are in close proximity to the site of the project?
Correct.
And
who determines which hydrants are going to be tested? I mean, I assume there's many hydrants that are within close proximity.
Right. We tried to, so companies come and do the testing. They're supposed to try, if they can, to have the fire flow hydrant and the gauge hydrant straddle the connection, the proposed connection to the site. Doesn't always work out that way. You're trying to examine the actual pipe that the connection is going to be made to. So, for instance, if you were trying to look at a connection that was going to go into the 12-inch main, and then you did a fire flow test, somewhat remotely behind where it was only connected to a 6-inch main, that may not give you the best results. But I think what I would keep going back to, though, is that the city, we do not rely on the fire flow test results to make an assessment of the adequacy of public facilities. We rely on the model. The only use of the actual fire flow test is to confirm that the static and residual pressures are showing what we would expect for those.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. For those
hydrants, those flow points that the test is being done on. So our model has nodes, and those nodes are essentially as close as possible to the location of the actual hydrant, so we can model it that way.
And how close do you have to get to the model standards? I mean, do you have to get exactly what the model requires?
No, because a model is just that. It's not going to be a perfect, but what was done when we developed and built the model was a significant calibration effort, which required us to do fire flow tests throughout the city at various conditions so that we could calibrate the model. So in other words, adjust it so that the model is giving good results in locations. But remember that at each test, this is somewhat of a dynamic system in that the tank elevations are going up and down, the pumps are on at the water treatment plant. It's a dynamic situation, and there could be, a use that is using a lot of water nearby that can make minor differences between the observed data and the model data. But generally, if it's within about 10%, you consider...
I didn't get that. Within what?
Within about 10%, you consider that to be a good model run.
So based on what you just explained, is there a degree of subjectivity in determining whether there's adequacy or not, or is it completely objective?
No. I'm very confident that you are within a very good, like I said, maybe you're going to come up with a static pressure that's 5 or 10% different than what is measured, but that is not an appreciable difference. And again, we've gone through building the model in a way such that we've gone through multiple places to check it. So we believe the model is very accurate, and it's shown that with the results that we've gotten from the fire flow tests. They observed have been very close to the.
So in coming to a conclusion about adequacy, are you expressing your own opinion, or are you just reviewing objective data and saying the objective data meets the standard?
Right.
Which one?
It's not an opinion. This is, the data is showing that this meets adequate public facility.
So do you know when fire suppression, the adequacy of fire suppression on site is as considered? I know that's a fire marshal
Right.
office consideration, but do you know yourself from your experience at the city, when is fire suppression considered, in other words, the adequacy of fire suppression?
So adequacy in terms of
Sprinklering.
the sprinkler design,
Yeah.
I would say it's during the building permit process.
Do you have anything to do with that in your review of
No.
adequate public facilities? You don't?
Adequate public facilities is before the permitting process, but if you're asking me if I'm directly involved with building permit reviews of fire suppression systems, I am not.
Okay. The bottom line is that fire suppression occurs after the adequate public facilities review. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Hold on one second, please. So, are you familiar with 2212-040 of the city code?
Yes.
I mean, okay.
Yes,
Is that,
I'm familiar with
do you use
that.
that?
It addresses fire.
You use that in your review?
I do not get involved directly with the review of that section.
Okay. Okay. I don't have.
There is a reference to fire flow and fire duration as it relates to the public system. That is what we're addressing in public
Does
works.
it relate to your review then? Because that's section A2 of that part of the city code. Do you need to see a copy of it?
I think I might have it here. Wait a minute.
It's under the fire.
A2, yes,
standards.
I have it here.
Yeah.
Right. So fire flow and duration come into play in a couple of different ways. As I was asked earlier about the storage requirements in the water system. So the study that was done and what is typically done is you're reviewing the entire system, including your distribution tanks and the storage capacity of the system. The city's storage capacity is adequate to meet the AWWA standards, American Water Works Association standards, that say that you want to have between 50 and 100% of your average daily flow. You want to have that capacity in your tanks. And also you want to be able to use the top half of your tanks for actual daily usage and emergency storage, and then you want to be able to use the bottom half for fire protection. So from that standpoint, we met those standards. We have adequate capacity in our distribution tanks for that.
Okay. Do you have any doubt that you considered all of the sources of information and data that you needed to consider?
I have no doubt.
Okay. Do you have any doubt that there's adequacy of water and sewer service to this property?
I do.
You don't have any doubt?
I don't have any doubt.
Okay.
Sorry.
I wasn't sure about the way I
Didn't answer the
phrased
right
that
question.
I'm sorry, but okay. But you got your answer, and so I appreciate that, and that's all the questions I have.
Okay.
Mr. Hyatt?
No redirect.
Mr. Rogers has redirect.
He doesn't have any
Cross. I
opportunity
had
for
cross because I never got to talk after he did.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's hear from the board first.
Thank you, Ms. Burkhardt. Thank you for your patience. I'm going to test it just a little bit more because I know that you've said this in many capacities, but I kind of want to cut through the brush here and get this clear and plain on the record that obviously the applicant forwarded a study by Bay Engineering relative to water flow, sewage, those things that fall within 2218.
Right.
That is your primary responsibility.
Correct.
And as I remember from the very beginning of your testimony, which seems like a while ago, that you don't take Bay Engineering's numbers out of hand. You don't accept them as given.
Correct.
You model them and then compare.
Right.
And if I recall just recently what you answered to Mr. Elson was that if it falls within about a 10% in comparison, that's usually a pretty fair and accurate model.
Give or take, and we're talking about the pressure.
Pressure.
So, right, so there's a couple of steps, and that
Right.
static pressure, if that's
And
give or
residual,
take.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying.
No.
And this is a nationally recognized standard of practice.
Correct.
American Water Works Association.
Correct.
As is required in the code.
Correct.
Great. So again, the city is doing its own modeling and not relying wholly or
Absolutely.
really at all, and you're really kind of putting their model to the test.
Correct.
Great. Thank you. Just one thing, I happened to notice as you were responding to some of the other questions that I don't know if this edifies some of the questions that were asked earlier, but in a memo that was sent from to Mr. Gutwald from Chief Stokes regards the interagency review of the commercial building to be located at 915 Chesapeake Avenue. This is dated 11/15/2018. Please find the following comments, and I assume this is in regard to the application for adequate public facilities. Among the comments and the bullet points, the second bullet point, the building must meet all applicable requirements in NFPA 101, the City of Annapolis Fire Prevention Code, and all other related codes and standards. By your testimony here tonight, you indicated, and you just answered to Mr. Elson, that those determinations will be made when the certificate process, which takes place after this, will happen. Fire suppression, the design of the fire sprinkler system, and those things will happen at that point.
Correct. It's my understanding.
Right. If the commercial is fully sprinkled in accordance with the City of Annapolis code, well, that's not going to bother. That's not your domain. The other question I had was on sewage capacity. If you could just explain to me again how you just are able to test, or model, I should say, that you have adequate sewage capacity for this site. Now, understanding that the use of the site will be different than a commercial site that currently exists.
Right. So what we're looking at is the downstream sewers, pipes, and pump stations to see that they have adequate capacity. The model incorporates all of those features, and we apply that flow, the new additional flow above and beyond what our original model was built on, and we add that flow and determine whether it exceeds that safety factor capacity of those systems downstream.
Great. So I'm not going to make you repeat this again because you've already answered this many times already affirmatively. It's your testimony here today that the water supply system is provided through the public facilities is adequate to the property site, both in water and sewage capacity.
Correct.
So it's adequate.
Correct.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Rogers, you have an opportunity for recross.
Thank you.
That means your questions are limited to issues addressed in Mr. Elson's cross.
Thank you. Chapter and section 22-12-030. A proposed project that will include a sprinkler system in accordance with this section shall be deemed to have adequate facilities under chapter whatever, ordinance 32. So, in your opinion, there's no reason to look at sprinklers or the flow for sprinklers?
I think the question that from Mr. Elson was in relation to 22-12-040-2, A2, and that was what I responded about. So,
but this one is also sprinklers. The subject.
So
is
I don't
sprinklers.
address.
You
I
don't
did not
address
address. What's the question?
this is basically the safety valve for adding sprinklers means that you don't have to consider the flow, because having sprinklers is like magic.
Okay. Is there a question for me?
Well, the question is, again, is flow. And
We
duration.
didn't hear that. The question is what?
Mr. Elson brought up the question about, or you did in your conversation about flow, time, duration, and your tanks. Did you know that the FPA standard tells you how many hours of flow you have to have?
And I think that is what goes into the AWWA recommendations, American Water Works recommendations as it relates to the tank capacity, and that's why I mentioned that, because that is the basis of our water and sewer study that was done that made the determination that we had adequate storage.
You know that there is no reference in the APF requirements to deal with AWWA?
Objection. It's not true. Not true.
Well, your testimony is no better than Mr. Rogers. Let's have the witness answer.
I apologize for that.
Thank you.
I don't understand the question.
Well, you keep citing AWWA, American Water
Correct.
Works Association, which I was once a member. But what the city code requires is state fire code, and by reference, NFPA.
Okay.
And you said you think the duration number in NFPA is part of your model.
I know it's part of the answer to the question of whether there is adequate capacity in the water distribution system. I know that because it's in the study.
All right, one more question. If I showed you this operations drawing here, you talked about location of hydrants in your conversation with Mr. Elson.
Yes.
If I told you the other hydrants were located on 6-inch pipes and 4-inch pipes,
Right.
would you want to, in this project, suggest that they make a loop around the property and make the pipes a little bigger because you're not going to get much water through a 4-inch pipe?
No, again, that, what I was saying is the ideal way to do a fire flow test is to straddle the proposed connection. However, ultimately, the city is using the model data that doesn't rely on that fire flow test result. So the model is saying there is adequate public facilities. The city does require that there's looped systems, and so that's something that comes about in the review of grading permits.
So in location of the hydrants, there's hydrants off of Americana, there's a couple on Chesapeake, there's one more down on Bay Ridge, but the back side of, on Norman Drive, has a 4-inch pipe.
Okay.
Is that of concern to you?
It depends on the system. Because a water system is under pressure, as you know, as a water engineer, that looped systems allow you to provide water pressure from multiple directions. If you're asking me if I would have installed a 4-inch line on a new public system today, no, I would not. But our standard is a minimum of a 6-inch main.
So maybe,
Today.
So maybe the backside on 26 November 2018, when this decision was made by this famous gentleman here, Mr. Gutwald, that was a 4-inch pipe on the backside, and it may be as deficient according to current standards.
I don't understand, the system is looped, so that may
It doesn't
not
meet-
be a problem.
It doesn't meet current standards.
If I was to design a new system, I would not allow a 4-inch main, if this is truly a main and not some other sort of service.
Did you run your model for a 3-hour fire or a 4-hour fire?
So the modeling, there's multiple parts of this that come into play. It's the capacity at the site for a flow, and then there's also the storage capacity. So how long can that flow be sustained? We're addressing the storage capacity, as I just mentioned, as it relates to the fact that this study showed that we met the standards that AWWA recommends for storage capacity, and it continues to meet that.
Ms. Burkhart, you have to meet NFPA as a part of this,
No,
the law.
that's not a question.
Okay. As part of the law, if you had to follow NFPA, would you have run the 4-hour or the 3-hour test in the model?
The model and the standards are addressed. When it was built, they addressed not only the model basically just tells it what it is. And then the study said, you have you have adequate storage in your system, you have adequate systems. There might be a couple places in the city where you need to do some improvements, and so the system is adequate based on the study and the model results.
Do you think looking at the NFPA standard is worthwhile?
NFPA, actually there's a lot of cross between, my understanding is there's a lot of cross uses between NFP and AWWA. A lot of the standards that AWWA has set up is based on NFPA or and vice versa. So there's a lot of commonality between the two, but I am not an expert with the NFPA, but I do understand basically that the standard in the industry is to do this sort of study where you look at the flow, fire flow, and you build the model and you determine whether your system is adequate.
Do you know that you are required to use the NFPA?
Who is required to use? For what?
The city.
Of course. Of course. But in Public Works, we aren't using NFPA, if you will, every day.
Thank you.
The objection, Your Honor, I think she needs to finish her answer. Let her explain herself.
She answered the answer. Thank you.
She didn't finish her answer.
So NFPA is a standard, right, that has to be required. Public Works does not directly deal with the standards in NFPA on a day-to-day basis. We use the standards, industry standards, that include American Water Works Association, and our system is adequate to meet those standards.
Thank you.
I don't look at in each individual site with respect to the NFPA requirements. That's not my responsibility at the city.
May I excuse the witness?
You may. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burkhart. What else do you have in store for us, Mr. Hyatt?
Next witness is Matthew Waters.
We'll try to accommodate anyone from the public sometime soon. Would you rather do that now before you start him, so you don't have to interrupt him, or?
I mean, I've just assumed he's the last witness from the Public Works Department, and if we can cluster that.
All right. I like your optimism.
Okay. I can move pretty quickly through the questioning. Mr. Waters, good evening. I apologize for the lateness of the hour.
tell the board who you are and what it is you do and where you work.
My name is Matt Waters. I work for the City of Annapolis Public Works. I'm the stormwater engineer for the city, and that's where we're at right now.
All right, so is one of your responsibilities to evaluate stormwater proposals submitted by various projects throughout the city?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the project that we're talking about tonight, the lofts at Eastport Landing?
Yes.
Currently, at the Eastport Shopping Center, there are no stormwater management techniques practiced today.
That is correct.
Nothing today. So anything that's done is an improvement to the environment.
That is correct.
Are you aware of the need to meet what is known as the adequate public facilities for stormwater?
Yes.
And that's under Chapter 22.24 of the code?
That is correct.
And that section of the code refers to Chapter 17.10 of the city code as well, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Bay Engineering, you've heard from prior witnesses, has prepared some documents, and they in fact prepared something called Final Storm Drain and Stormwater Management Report. That's our Exhibit 5, from originally prepared in July of 2018, revised in September of 2018, and revised again in November of 2018. Are you familiar with that report?
That is correct.
When you receive a report like that from Bay Engineering, what is it that you do?
So when I get a report from someone like Bay Engineering or any other engineering firms, I go through the report, I read it, I evaluate all the computations that are in there, and make sure that they meet the state standards and the city code.
Okay.
And I also compare those to the plans as well.
Mr. Jarrell, you've heard testify, and you heard Ms. Burkhart also testify that he issued this November 13th, 2018 memo. That's our Exhibit 1D, that stated that stormwater management facilities for the lofts at Eastport Landing would be adequate. And do you agree with that conclusion?
I do.
Would you explain to the board how it is that you arrived at that conclusion that stormwater management facilities as proposed would be adequate for this project?
So for to meet adequate public facilities, there's two components to it. One of the components is the ability to handle a 10-year storm, and also to comply with 1710 of our code, which has to do with the state standards. So basically what I look for when I'm reviewing a project, this particular project is a redevelopment project, which means that the existing impervious area is greater than 40%, and so they have a different set of regulations that are required by the state code to meet the volume that is generated through a computation that we have to do. There's practices that are put on the site to treat a volume of water, and this particular project had microbioretention and green roofs, several microbioretention areas.
The adequacy process is at the beginning stage of the whole project. Would you agree with that?
That is correct.
And you've heard some discussion about the contamination on the site. Not a surprise. You're aware that there was formerly a gasoline station on the site?
That is correct.
And that the tanks were removed, I think it was 12 or 13 years ago, right? I think.
It was before I started working with the city.
And are you familiar with that letter that Mr. Jarrell read a portion of, that April 29th letter?
Yes.
From the MDE, April 29th, 2019 letter?
Yes.
Right. So is it fair to say that your approval of adequacy is at the first stage, and then whatever may happen on the site with regard to the actual installation, that requires a permit?
That is correct.
And so there would be a permit application, and at that time you would review what's going on with the site, with the MDE and the voluntary cleanup program, to make certain that there's no contamination that is carried into the waters of the Chesapeake Bay or its tributaries, right?
Yes. So when we go to a grading permit process, one of the things that they will have to provide to us is if there's a new plan to take care of contamination on the site or something like that, that would have to be included in the permit package.
Okay. But that's not what goes on for purposes of the adequacy of public facilities certification.
That's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you. That concludes my question.
Mr. Elson?
So the two forms of stormwater management on the property are proposed to be microbioretention systems and green roof.
Yes, I believe there's 8 microbioretention areas and I believe 3 green roof areas.
How does a green roof area work?
So the green roof basically has planting material. So it's an at the source kind of treatment. So essentially, when the rainfall hits it, it slows down. It's not like hitting pavement where when rainfall hits the pavement, it moves pretty quickly. When it hits grass, it goes slower. So it's kind of mimicking more of a grass situation.
What makes the green roof adequate for this particular project?
With green roofs for this project, it kind of makes sense because you have the large roof area for the structure, and they can make it an amenity where people can walk around up there. I believe that's what was the initial idea for it.
Is there follow-up inspection of the green roof? You know, once the grading permit is issued, and once the building permit gets issued and construction is complete, is there anything governing inspection or maintenance of the green roof or the microbioretentions for that matter?
So with every grading permit, maintenance agreement's required for the project for the stormwater management components. So it will be attached to land records, and it will be the responsibility of the property owner to maintain those practices. So to answer your first part of the question, after the grading permit is issued, construction commences, and once that's complete, the applicant will come back and say, I would like to have a bond inspection, because we also have a bond that covers the projects as well. So we would have an inspection with to take a look at all the stormwater management practices to make sure that they are similar sized and to what was in the plans, and verify that the state requirements were met and the city requirements were met. If everything's good, the bond gets reduced to 10% of the original value, and a year later we'll come back and re-inspect to make sure that that is still functioning and is still being maintained.
Okay. And that's true with any stormwater management device?
That's for every stormwater management device, yeah. And then after that, it goes into our program with our MS4 permit, where we are going to check on them once every 3 years.
Okay. How long is the maintenance bond or the reduction in the bond for generally?
So the maintenance reduction, or the going to what's called a maintenance bond from the original bond, is good for 1 year, and then we come back out and take a look at it. Okay. If there's issues, the bond does not get released. So we hang on to that last 10% for at least 1 year.
So is it if any issues are going to arise with the stormwater management device, what is the likelihood that they would occur within that 1 year period?
The first year is the most critical time for any stormwater management practice, because depending on what type of practices you have, but like for microbioretention, for instance, in green roofs, you want to get the vegetation established in those practices. If those vegetation, like if the plants don't take, need to be replaced, that's something that will happen in that first year. The other issue could be if there's ponding or something like that happening on the practice, that would be noticed almost right away as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So are the 3 green roof areas in this case, are they grassy areas, or are they vegetation type areas?
I can't say off the top of my head, but I imagine it's going to be like a grass type plantings, and but it's specified what type of vegetation they're going to have up there, and the green roof itself has to have specifications for that as well to make sure that it's meeting the standards.
So are you the person that decides what devices are going to be used for stormwater management?
I do not decide what's to be used for the site. That's up to the engineer. I just review to make sure that it's in compliance with the state regulations.
Okay, so if the engineer proposes devices that you determine are not acceptable, what do you do?
I would let them know, and they would be required to do revisions. Like for instance, I don't remember exactly what type of green roof is being used on this project, but there is a type of green roof out there called EcoLine, which is basically it's a proprietary product that has a green roof thickness that's 4 inches, but it gets credit for 8 inches. And that's something that MDE has tested and reviewed and approved that can meet that 8 inches of treatment. There are some other things out there too, like a modular wetland, which is basically an in the ground type of thing, or something like Silva cells is another type of practice that MDE has reviewed and said that this meets the standards, and here's how you apply these standards. So anything that has an MDE approval that's a proprietary product, it can be used.
Okay. Do you know if MDE has anything to do with the state standards for stormwater management? In other words, the development of those standards?
Yeah, so MDE wrote the standards for it, and they were revised in 2010. That's the most current standard that we are using now. Okay. Before that was 2000.
And are the city standards in compliance with state standards?
They are. There's been an ordinance that's passed that requires additional treatment, and that was done in January, but that doesn't apply to this project.
Okay, but just because of the timing of the passage of that ordinance?
I'm sorry, what's that?
It doesn't apply because of the timing of the passage of that ordinance. It was just recent.
Sorry, I misspoke. It's actually a resolution, not an ordinance.
All right, it is a resolution. You're right.
Yeah. It's late. I'm sorry.
Okay, it's okay. So this project was in process way before the passage of that resolution, right?
Right. The resolution started in January, late January, and how we determined what would be grandfathered in is if you had an approval for like a site design project, or it was submitted for a grading permit, and this project had the approval.
Okay. Regarding the microbioretention devices, can you explain to the board exactly what they are, as briefly as you can?
Sure. So a microbioretention area is essentially, it's basically a practice that has planting media with some stone or sand at the bottom of it, and this is all underground, and then there's like mulch at the top, some temporary ponding and plantings in there, and basically what happens is water flows into the practice, temporarily ponds on the surface, infiltrates into the ground, and for this particular site there's underdrain that's being proposed as well because of the soil types that are there, which is D soils, which is not very well infiltrating soils. So there's an underdrain system in there that basically helps dewater the practice.
Okay. So why was it, in your mind, acceptable to approve the microbioretention areas for this particular project?
So it's the drainage area that's coming to those is a little bit larger than what a rain garden could handle, and rain garden is very similar. It's just a smaller type of practice, but it meets the criteria that's outlined by the state manual, and it's an acceptable practice to be there.
What is the state manual?
It's the It's called the 2010 Stormwater Management Manual, volumes 1 and 2.
Are you required to adhere to the standards in that manual?
Yes.
What other regulations or laws are you required to adhere to in determining whether there's adequacy of stormwater management on the property?
So 1710 of our city code, which basically reflects the same thing as what's in the state code with that, with that manual. I also take a look at preliminary erosion sediment control plans at this point too, which is the I forget what year that manual was put together, but I believe it's the 2011 erosion sediment control manual, and that just gives guidance on how things are basically constructed.
Do you know? You say, I think before you said MDE helped develop or did develop the state standards for stormwater management. Does MDE also develop the stormwater management manual?
The erosion sediment control. Yes. And they also you can get certification with that. So there's the responsible person certification, which is basically it's online, and you can go through the certifications, and it basically goes over all the different types of erosion sediment control practices that are used on site, and how they work.
Okay. And did you go to the site of this project during the course of your review?
Yes.
What's the purpose of that?
Just to get a look at a few things and verify a few things that are on the plans.
Okay.
I try to get out to the sites when I can because it helps visualize everything a little bit better too.
Did you already have the applicant's plans at that point?
Yes.
Okay. And was there anything on their plans that caused you any concern? In other words, I'm sorry, did you ask them to revise anything? I guess that's the most proper question.
If I had any concerns, it was made in comments for the project, which required revisions.
Okay. Were there any revisions required to the plans in this project?
Previous iterations of the plan, yes.
Okay. How many times did they revise?
I believe it was 3 or 4 times.
And is that the result of your instructions to them that they needed to show this particular thing or that particular thing on their plans? Or
Right,
change
yeah, it could have been
things?
something like an inconsistency from the report to what was shown on the plans, or I don't have all those comments in front of me, but that's the process. Or if there was I know early on when this project first came out, there was a question about, since it's redevelopment, what you need to know about is what the impervious area is, and there's one section of the lot where this development is going is grass covered, but there was a document that said that it's accepted as impervious area because that's where the cap is for the gas station.
Okay. So you are concerned with what's, the square footage of this lot that's impervious and the square footage that is pervious? Or
right. So with stormwater management and determining what the volume that you're required to treat is based on your percent impervious on the site, and also your soil types and those type of things. For redevelopment, the first thing that you're required to do is try to remove, for the state standards, is 50% of the existing impervious area within the limited disturbance. And then if you can't do all that, then you should look at doing what's called environmental site design, which is the microbioretentions, the rain gardens, and green roofs and those type of practices to treat at the source. If you can't do that, then you look for something else to do. So you basically get a volume that you're required to treat, and that's what was outlined by engineering.
So when you give approval to the stormwater management plan and all other things being equal, the grading permit is issued, do you ever review the stormwater management on site again? I mean, do you go back there to determine whether they're complying with the specifications that you approved?
Yes. So after a project's complete, when we do the bond inspection, that's kind of where we do the QA/QC of the stormwater management. I go out to the site, I check for, there's sometimes monitoring wells installed, so that way you can see what's going on below the surface. Like you can see if there's ponding water or something like that. That's when I do that inspection to make sure that they were properly installed. I can also measure the depth of the monitoring wells, and that tells me how deep those practices are. So that's kind of where we verify if things were constructed per the plans. I check to make sure that the ponding depth is there correctly. That's really where we do that post-construction.
Okay.
And that results in the reduction of the bond or the release of the bond.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions.
Sure.
Mr. Rogers, how long is your cross going to take?
Oh, probably 20 minutes.
Let's hear from the public then. We'll come back to your cross. All right, is there anyone here from the public who believes they have something to say about the criteria for the adequate public facilities? Fire, traffic, sewer, water, any of those things, who would like to testify tonight because they can't come on the 18th?
My name is Heidi Halleck. I live at 512 4th Street. And I'm not going to speak long here. I just want to note that I just want to reserve to make sure we're clear, to say that I think that there's going to be plenty more provided by Mr. Rogers, and that I think a lot of us would like to address it. It's late. The air conditioning is not working well in here. And I think that I just want to make sure we don't waive the issues, that we can come back and discuss it, because I do think there are plenty of concerns from the neighbors, but I'd like to make the comments, have the opportunity to make the comments at the completion of...
That's why I recommend that members of the public do that, and you're certainly welcome to do that.
And I just want to make sure. But before we do that, I want to jump ahead. I want to make a comment as to whether, on this process in general, I hear you, and as the chairman of the board, to say at the beginning, you said the standard of review of this hearing, and I want to make sure I understand that. You said this is a de novo hearing. But then you said the burden of proof is on Mr. Rogers. And I just want to be sure that we understand that the burden of proof when a de novo hearing is on the applicant and not on the Mr. Rogers.
I don't remember saying that.
Yeah, and I just want to, that was a concern I had on the first night, and I just want to make sure that we understand when it's de novo, the applicant has the burden of proof to proceed as they initially do, to show that there are adequate public facilities.
We understand that.
And that if the application lacks certain information, or that the city didn't have information in front of it, that it's important to get that done. And I think that Mr. Rogers will then address the gaps, and then I'd like to comment at that point. Thank you.
We're looking forward to Mr. Rogers putting on his case.
I have one question for you, or one comment. In fact, the rules do say it's de novo, and appellant has the burden of proof. That's what the rules of the Board of Appeals state.
And it's important then to say, what is the burden of proof? To show that there is an abuse of discretion by the city as to whether or not they approved it or not? Or is the burden of proof that there's sufficient evidence on the record to support the finding that you have? And if those are the standards of the burden of proof, that's an appellant standard. So the question of what is the burden of proof, is it to show that there are adequate public facilities? Does he have to show that there aren't? Or do you have to show that there are? And I think, and this isn't whether there was an abuse of discretion by the city. The question is whether there are adequate public facilities. And I think the board needs to establish what it is that each of you have to show in this hearing.
We understand your comments. Thank you. Anyone else tonight? Good. All right, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. Good evening, Matt. What is the size of the shopping center site?
Let's pause for 5 minutes. Are we ready to resume?
You ready? What is the size of the shopping center site overall?
I don't know that off the top of my head. It was in the stormwater management report and on the plans.
So in order to compute impervious area, what do you need to know?
You need to know the site area, the whole entire parcel area, and the amount of impervious that's on that site.
Was there a dispute with the state about that number, the percent number? Did they question the number that's in the report? The state.
I don't recall the state.
Was there a memo about that within the city, about the size of, the amount of impervious area?
There was a memo that clarified that the grassy area near the gas station could be used, or could be considered as impervious because of the cap.
And that was decided that the grassy vegetated area was like concrete.
I don't recall all the details of that
It
memo,
was
but
totally 100% impervious.
yes, that's how we took it, as it was impervious area.
Well, I kind of put words in your mouth. I said concrete. So if I told you that that 14-foot strip of the shopping center that's vegetated as impervious, as pervious area, if I took that away from the calculation, what would the number be?
I can't answer that question. I don't.
I'm going to show you Appellant's Exhibit 6.
Okay.
So I yellowed a strip here along Bay Ridge, which is about 600 feet, 619 feet.
Okay.
And the deed says it's 14 feet wide, but it doesn't look like it belongs to the shopping center.
Is that a question?
Does it belong to the shopping center?
I don't.
You're an engineer, you can read maps.
I'm not going to answer that question because that's not relevant to this conversation, I believe.
Well, it is relevant.
Well, I would object. I mean, how is that related to the direct examination? It shows there's a 14-foot strip. I mean, it doesn't tell us anything.
What is it you really want to know, Mr. Ryan?
Did you include that strip in your calculations?
First of all, I didn't do the calculations. I reviewed the calculations that were done by Bay Engineering. And if that area is included in that, if that area is included or not, I don't think that would really make a difference. It still would be classified as redevelopment. And the majority of that area is outside the limit of disturbance, which is not used for the calculation of what is required for stormwater management for the site.
I would like you to think that answer again over, because we have come up with a number that's 98% impervious. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I can't answer that without looking at the computations and things like that. I'm not sure where you're pulling these numbers from.
If it were 98% impervious instead of the 92.5, which you say you validated from Bay Engineering, what does that change? Does it change the amount of treatment required?
So if that area is within the limited disturbance for the project, then it would. If that area is not in the limited disturbance of the project, it doesn't matter. Redevelopment, to be classified as a redevelopment project, you look at the entire site and you determine what the percent impervious for the entire site is. If it's greater than 40%, then it's classified as redevelopment. If it's under 40%, then it's classified as new development. Then when it's redevelopment, you strictly look at the limited disturbance of the site, and that is how you determine what your stormwater management requirement is. You take 50% of that existing impervious area, and you have to treat that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could... So the limited disturbance, just so I'm clear, for this site particularly, we're talking about the area that is bordering Chesapeake and Americana. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So it would be where the movie theater is now and the area in front of it?
Yes. Yeah, and the area that's the 14 feet that we're talking about is right up against the roadway.
Right. Okay. But I just wanted to clarify what the particular part of the site that you're referring to.
Right.
So the reasoning why they consider the grassy vegetated area, which was the old gas station site, the reason they called that impervious instead of pervious was because of what?
Because of the cap for the project that they did.
Is there a cap on there?
Underneath the ground, as far as I know.
There's no cap there, sir.
But that's what the NDE
Have
letters.
you? Absolutely no cap. That's referred to as man-made soil if you read all the reports. Man-made soil does qualify for impervious. They're saying it's not natural soil. So the answer to the question is based on the course that you and I attended together.
And I would like to point out some things about that course, too. There were a lot of mistaken things that were said in that course. And I was kind of appalled that we had to pay for that.
You could solve the question of whether that's impervious or pervious if you went out and did a test pit and if you did a infiltration test. Is that right?
If there's documentation that says that that this area would be classified as something like that, as impervious or pervious, then that information is what the engineers designed the project on. And so that's...
So if you want to do a microbial retention pit, I'll call it a pit. I'm old school. Should they do a test pit to find out what the soil's like that they're going to drain into?
And they did do soil borings on the project.
Pardon?
They did do soil borings on the project, too.
Boring. Did they do test pits?
They did soil borings to determine where the groundwater tables are and infiltration rates.
Did they do any drainage tests in the test pits?
That's something that would be required for the grading permit phase of the project.
Do you know where the groundwater level is?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
If I gave you all of my Exhibit 18 that has probably 50 or 60 borings with water levels in it, and then the reports saying that the water level is between 8 and 10 feet, would you believe that?
That's reasonable.
So do you think it's important to know where the water table is versus how big the bioretention pit is, how deep it is?
That does drive it.
Pardon?
It does drive the design.
So you want at least about a foot so the water by gravity drains out.
You want at least 4 feet from the inverts.
4 feet from?
The inverts of the microbioretention areas. And that's stated in the state manual.
So if the water table's at 8 feet and you gotta have 4-foot separation, you can only have a 4-foot deep bioretention.
Yeah.
And there's supposed to be 8 of these, is that correct?
Yes, around the site.
So what is in the bottom of the bioretention? Is there a pipe?
Yes, so you can have under drains in the bottom of the practices to help with dewatering, especially if you're in hard soil.
So if you only had 4-foot deep bioretention, that water's going to go pretty fast to that pipe. And where is that pipe connected?
It won't go that fast as you're making it
But where
seem.
is the pipe connected?
It connects into the storm drain system.
Ah. Are you aware of Chapter 1 of the MDE Stormwater Manual that you referred to earlier, where it says stormwater cannot be drained into hotspots?
I am aware of that.
So this drawing that Mr. Hyatt, or the applicant, so graciously gave us, I've colored in pink the bioretentions and the stormwater pipe from them, and they're within 50 feet of the hotspot. Is that good?
So those practices could have a liner put in on the bottom of them that prevents water from infiltrating into those practices.
Into what?
Like a liner to prevent water from the practice infiltrating into the ground and also from the ground infiltrating into the practices.
So there's going to be a liner in the
There could
pit?
be a liner that could be put in there to prevent the contaminants from leaving the site. But also when the site, when it goes through MDE review for changing from commercial, which we talked about earlier extensively, to a residential or mixed use, then there will be additional mitigations that needs to be done out there. So they may remove a lot of the soil. They may get the contamination level down so low that it may not be considered a hotspot anymore.
You know, I compliment you. That's a great question. I wish I'd answered it. This has to be revised to comply with mixed use.
But this is not.
Because
this
it
is not
doesn't
a-
meet, it doesn't meet the standards that don't exist.
Objection. It's not a question.
Question?
It's a
Is there a
statement.
question?
Does it meet the mixed use standards?
Stormwater management doesn't apply to mixed use or things like that. It applies to what's required for a project to go forward. There's no separate standard for mixed use.
So you validated the question we got earlier, which says there are no current standards for mixed use development. They're only for residential, commercial, and for groundwater. Is that true? In the state cleanup?
There
manual?
are no standards for stormwater management established by the uses in zoning.
So what is the fallback standard when you have this conundrum?
I think we're completely off track on this point.
I don't think so. We're trying to make sure that it's important, and it's in the purpose of adequate public facilities for you and the rest of the staff to ensure the public safety.
Objection. Objection.
And
He's-
for the
he's
environment.
lecturing.
We need a question. We need a question.
And the question is, if we have no standards, how can you approve it?
We have standards for what volume is required to be treated per the state code and the city code. And this project demonstrates that they were meeting that volume requirement for stormwater management.
If you have pits that are in contamination, how can you say you're complying with Chapter 1 of the Stormwater Manual?
This isn't a grading permit at this point. This is the conceptual level of the project. That's what we're looking at, is to make sure conceptually that this project will work.
If I were
Okay,
to take
and
a Geiger counter,
Objection, Your Honor. He hasn't finished his answer.
if I were to take a,
Wait, Do you have you finished your answer?
Yes. So we're at the conceptual level of this project. As someone who is developing the project, they want to make sure that we're okay with them moving forward with this project so that they can go to the MDE and say, hey, we have this conceptual approval and then we can move forward on this project. What do we need to do to meet these standards for you guys to clean up the site more and then be able to do the project? That would be incorporated into the grading permit of the project. We have other projects in the city where this has happened, where, like for instance, the Enclave on Spa Road, that was a project site that had contamination in the soil, and as part of that project was to remove the contaminated soils before the project could continue.
So if you know this ahead of time, if you read Exhibit 18, would you not want to kind of short-circuit this revolving door and take care of this ahead of time?
They're not going to get a grading permit that doesn't take care of that.
How do I know? There's no hearing. Is there a hearing for a grading permit?
I don't know what you're...
So how is the public going to keep track? This gets buried in the grading permit.
Can you answer the question how the public is going to keep track? We're not arguing, Mr. Rogers. We're not here for you to argue with the witness.
Okay, I'm trying to find out how I can track this problem.
You asked him if there was an opportunity for the public. If you want the answer, you have to let him give the answer.
Is there an answer?
We post in our eTrack-It program all the permits that come in here. It's assigned to the address to the site, and it will be in there every review, every inspection that goes on, all the related other parts of the permit, like the site design review or the bond. It's all linked in there.
Okay, thank you. Let's shift gears a little bit. There's a term called over the bank.
Yeah.
Over the bank flow in the stormwater manual says that you're supposed to test that with a iteration with a 100-year storm. If your discharge is more than 150 feet away from the site, and it is not in tidal waters. Is that a true statement?
Yeah.
So the discharge point is how far from the site?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Try 170 feet. It's in the permit.
I'm sorry, I don't remember everything I read in every single permit.
The extreme condition is what? It's in the manual.
The extreme condition for, you mean like a 100-year storm?
Right. But your answer says you didn't consider it. The adequate public facilities and the stormwater plan says it's not required to do that iteration.
Because it discharges the tidally influenced waters. I know.
The site currently flows north and east into the drains, down 170 feet downstream. Does that require an over-the-bank test?
I don't recall off the top of my head right now.
That's really important, isn't it? Have you been to the stream bed?
Yes, I've gone out there.
This one that has the pretty pictures? Exhibit 1?
Yeah.
Is there a great big 8-foot hole where the discharge is going into and the stream bed is scouring? Is that true?
That is true, but I believe also when this project went through Planning Commission, there was also something mentioned in there about the developer contributing to a project to take care of the outfall. And
is it on the plans?
It's part of the conditions of the Planning Commission, which gets incorporated into the grading permit, which that will have to be done.
Was it on one version of the plans and got taken off?
It's not on the current plans.
Was it on a previous version?
It was on a previous version.
Thank you. So based on what you know now, and you and I have both seen the stream bed, as a good conservative engineer, would you recommend stream bank protection and the over-the-bank test on that flow?
I believe that what will happen when the project goes through is that there'll be a less runoff going to that stream at the outfall during a rain event.
Less runoff.
Yes, because it'll be absorbed into the different practices, it'll be slowed down, and it won't be an immediate discharge like it is now.
Suppose you can't put any bioretention pits in that site. Suppose MDE says no. These are hot, this is a hot spot, you can't do this when they get it to review. So how do you take care of that water?
You could put an impermeable liner at the bottom of the practices to prevent it from infiltrating into the ground, so you're still capturing that volume and slowing down that volume at the source and preventing it from getting into the storm drains right away.
So in an NPDES permit, non-point discharge permit, which the Public Works Director, even though he doesn't know it, he's in charge of it, does that require a pre-construction plan, a during construction plan, and a post-construction plan?
You know, I'm going to object. Mr. Chairman, we're getting far afield from APF. We acknowledge, this witness acknowledges, the prior witnesses acknowledge that there are things that take place subsequently when there's an application made for permits. That's all Mr. Rogers is talking about here. What's going to happen in the future with permits, it's not an APF issue.
Well, he's entitled to ask him what he did relating to APF.
Right.
And when he gets the answer to that, then he's entitled to ask him, well, did you do this and this and this, if they're any way related to APF. I think that's what he's doing. But I'm starting to wonder whether we're getting too far afield myself. So
thank you, sir. So did you do a general permit for the site?
That's not my responsibility.
Who is going to do the general permit?
That would be the applicants.
What are the requirements for a general permit?
What does that have to do with APF?
Because the MDE general permit has to do with sites that have contamination on them and the stormwater. And the stormwater has to be treated in a general permit.
He's told you what he's done. He told you that...
So he hasn't done a general permit, that's all. Thank you. And I'll ask you this question a second way. You do not know whether that 14-foot strip of land was included in the impervious calculation or not.
Objection. It's been asked and answered, probably a couple of times.
Well, one more time. So,
I don't recall off the top of my head. That's on the site plans. There's documents in the site plans that show us.
He told you why it doesn't matter, and now he's told you that he doesn't remember.
What is the primary use of a green roof?
The treat runoff at the source.
Has nothing to do with heating and ventilating?
That's a secondary. But I mean, if you're asking me for questions like that, that's outside of stormwater management. For stormwater management, it treats runoff at the source. It's an alternative surface.
Where does the green roof water go?
It filters through, and there's a drain system that connects into the storm drain ultimately.
When you calculate or did a check calculation on the volume of stormwater, did you consider the stormwater in all the tributary areas?
I look at the site, at where it's treated on the site, and how it runs through the site, and then connects into a storm drain system. The system currently is functioning. We don't have complaints of flooding with that area. So what we do is, we look at the site itself and how the site contributes to the drainage area.
When it rains and you have a grassy area, it rains for 3 days, what happens to that soil?
It can get soft. It depends on there's a lot of factors that go into it, but the grass can get soft.
Saturated, probably.
Most likely.
So Now comes a 10-year storm.
You're asking a question, I know where you're going with this, but you're asking a question that the way the MDE manual is written, it looks at not consecutive storms happening. So it doesn't consider saturated soils and then a 10-year storm happens or a 100-year storm happens. That's not how the MDE manual is written.
Well, does the 100-year storm have a different inches volume of water than a 10-year storm?
It does. But then again, you can't design everything to a 100-year storm or 500-year storm or a 1,000-year storm.
I didn't ask that question.
But that's where you're going with this.
No, it's not.
All right, let him ask a question.
So if you had the tributary area that was 3 times the size of the shopping center, order of magnitude, what kind of flow do you suppose you would get?
I can't answer that question. There's a lot of factors that go into that.
The shopping center is 98% impervious, or 92, and it's...
You're asking me something arbitrary of...
So what's...
You're saying, here's a drainage area.
So what's
Just tell
the
me
flow? What's the flow from the site to the storm drain?
There's a lot of factors that go into that, that changes.
What is it in the study?
I don't recall that off the top of my head. I look at a lot of permit reviews, Mr. Rogers.
If I told you there was going to be 100 CFS going to that manhole that goes into the stream bed, if you had a 3-day rain and a 10-year storm, you had sheet flow on the grass, which is a term in the manual. If you had sheet flow, you're going to get upwards of 100 CFS. And that storm sewer...
You're testifying again, Judge.
Okay, I'm going to ask him the question.
No.
So what happens if you get 100 CFS through that manhole?
I can't answer that question. You're asking me, you're throwing just random numbers out and saying, give me an answer. That's not how this works. I'm sorry. You need to have more concrete answers. You have to tell me the drainage area. You need to tell me what type of, what kind of properties are in that area. You definitely have impervious area on the site, but other factors that feed into that storm drain system. It's a whole modeling exercise that you're just totally ignoring. You're just saying, just give me an answer on this.
Is this the same question that I gave to you were here listening? Is this the same question I gave to Ms. Burkhart about the sewage system? She did the city part of the storm system, of the sewage system. Have you done your city part of the storm drain system?
I've reviewed this for adequacy.
That's not the question. Have you done the calculations? Do you have a model? Have you done the calculations to ensure...
I confirmed the models that they did.
Let me finish. Have you done the calculations to prove that the city has adequate stormwater facilities downstream in the city part of the system?
I reviewed the information produced by Bay Engineering, and I reviewed it, and it seemed adequate.
So the same question I'm going to ask you as I asked her. When are you going to publish the real adequate public facilities document for stormwater management? When?
Is that a rhetorical question?
Yeah.
No.
I think it is. Do you know the answer to the question?
I'm not sure where he's going with it.
Yeah. All right. That's enough. Move on.
Are you aware of something called LEED?
LEED?
LEED.
Yes. Can you spell that?
L-E-E-D.
Objection. That is not part of APF.
Well, tell us how it's
It gets
connected
into building
to APF.
permits and is not part of APF.
Tell us how LEED relates to
Section of the
stormwater.
code, 1710-040 or something, says that it's linked to the stormwater management and the other issues in the adequate public facilities, and that they get a rating in LEED for doing a really good job or a poor job on some of these design issues. And this is submitted, and it's supposed to have LEED numbers associated with each one of these areas.
You can ask him if he's familiar with that.
I do not review for leads.
Thank you. If the applicant wants to tear up part of city streets to fix the storm drain system, put in new pipes for storm drain, who pays for that?
Objection, relevance.
Yeah, how does that relate to adequate public facilities?
Because the facilities are not adequate if they have to tear up the city street. What's in the street is not adequate.
But if say they determine that and there's agreement that it's going to be fixed, what does it matter who pays for it?
Because it's my tax dollars. I'm a citizen.
That's not a relevant question.
No, it is a relevant question because the storm drain in the street is inadequate for what they want to do, and they want to change it, and then we're going to pay for it.
You
That's
can,
not.
you can ask them whether
it's not in the 6-year plan either.
You can ask them whether it's adequate or not. You can ask them whether they considered the need for capital improvements.
Is it in the capital improvement program for the 27-inch pipe that they're proposing to put in the street?
And they're going to be putting it in.
Are they going to pay for it?
Yeah, it's on the grading. It would be on the grading permit.
That they're going to pay for it?
If they propose to change it, they would be responsible for replacing it.
Thank you. That's all I've got.
All right. Mr. Hyatt?
Mr. Waters, the new resolution that you talked about for treatment on developed property requires 75%.
Yes, for redevelopment.
For redevelopment, 75% of treatment of existing impervious.
That's correct.
But this particular project preceded that resolution, and what was required for this project? What percent?
50%.
And how, do you recall how much is actually being treated? It's a lot more than 50%, isn't it?
That is correct. It's, I think, around 74%.
So it's almost.
You're not testifying, right? You're not testifying.
No,
right?
no. I asked a slightly leading question. Okay. So it's almost 74%.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
This is the Hyatt rule.
That's enough. Now it's your turn.
And today, nothing takes place on that site. So all the stormwater is untreated and goes into the system, into the creek untreated.
That is correct.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mr. Elson? No. Gentlemen?
Nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. I think that will be a good place to end for this evening. Mr. Hyatt, can you give us a preview of what's left of your case?
I have Dr. Nash, Mr. Gutwald, Kwaku, and then we have I was going to hold back the environmental expert that I had for rebuttal, but since it's all out there, I think I'll call him in my case in chief. So it'd be 4 witnesses.
Okay.
And we're on the record for September 18th, so we don't have to post except for 15 days in advance of the 18th, right?
Right.
Just out of, okay.
Courtesy.
Courtesy, okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, Mr.
Can we
White.
find out from the city what they have to do?
Do you have witness plans you can tell us about, Mr. Elson?
Right now, it would just be Tom Smith.
Okay.
That could change depending on what we hear the next
Yeah.
time, but right now, it's just Mr. Smith.
And, okay, then it's your turn, Mr. Rogers. What can you tell us about previewing your case?
I have one expert plus myself. Expert.
You're going to examine yourself?
Yes, sir. It's going to be interesting.
It's always interesting. Will you object to your own questions?
I don't think so.
All right.
Motion to adjourn.
Second? Second. All in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you all very much. See you September 18th.